I just want to start off by saying that, to make this story easier to understand, I'm going to use a lot of dialogue. Obviously, this wasn't recorded, so these aren't the exact words of anyone involved in this experience. I'm just trying to tell it as best as possible, and I think that it'll benefit me and you if I use a lot of quotes. Just keep in mind, most of it is not direct. This will be a long one, so let's get into it. This happened in 2015, when I was 16 and still living in my hometown. A forgotten little beach town in the middle of nowhere that's so remote, it's probably not even known by surrounding areas. Basically, there's 3 things you can do there as a teenager. Go to the movies, swim, or go to this pathetic little place called Miller's Fun Park. It's relatively similar to a lot of fun park type things, only a whole lot worse. There's a crappy arcade with broken skee-ball machines, batting cages that probably haven't been used since the early 80s, a pathetic mini golf course, and the most dangerous go-karts you've probably ever seen in your life. Seriously. Miller's Fun Park is on the edge of a field. On the opposite side of the field, about 3 miles down, is the beach, and across the single street are woods. If our town is in the middle of nowhere, Miller's is practically on the moon. Anyway, getting into the story. My cousin Emma and I decided one summer night that we wanted to go go-karting. It was around 10 p.m. so we knew it would be almost deserted, but that was the way that we liked it. I picked her up from my house and we made the long drive down. Once we had arrived and parked in the nearly empty lot, we hopped out of the car and paid for some go-karting tickets. The same people had worked there forever, I swear to God. There was no one there except for a few boys in the arcade, and a guy who looked to be in his 60s sitting on a beach near the batting cages. Emma and I paid him no mind, and went to the go-kart track. Like I said, these karts were incredibly dangerous, so I was focused on nothing but making sure I wasn't going to skid and flip as we raced way too fast around the windy track. This is why I didn't notice the guy walking over to the fence, and why I didn't notice him watching us until we pulled into the lanes after our last lap. He was standing on the other side of the fence, right where I parked. He stared at me with the most unsettling expression, a creepy smile playing on his cracked lips as his dark eyes gleamed. I managed an uneasy smile back, handed another ticket to the guy running the go-karts, who was obviously higher than a kite, and Emma and I went off again. This time I couldn't focus. This dude gave me the worst type of feeling. My eyes were constantly finding their way to the metal fence where he stood, unmoving and watching us every time we were in his view. And the thing that was bothering me the most was that we only had bought 3 tickets. We were on our second to last run and he was standing directly next to the exit gate. I was just praying that he would move before we were done. But of course, no such luck. Our last go came and went, and I had no choice but to pull in next to him, unbuckle my seatbelt, and get out of my go-kart. I glanced over at Emma a few feet away as I opened the exit gate to see if she was as scared as I was, but she didn't seem to notice as she bounced over and bragged about how she had beat me the last 2 times. I was barely listening. I opened the gate and the guy stepped in front of me just as I was leaving. "Hey there," he said. His voice was dry and he smelled of cigarettes. "What are you cute girls doing all alone here?" My eyes darted over to Emma, who was looking at the dude with both confusion and annoyance. What?" she said, pushing past the gate so she stood beside me. "It's so late." His tone was as hungry as his eyes, and he reminded me of a snake. "Do your parents know that you're out?" "Yes," I answered quickly. "They're waiting for us actually. We need to get going." This was a lie and it probably sounded like it from my tone, but I tried to push past him anyway. It didn't work. He grabbed my shoulder to keep me in front of him. "Nonsense. I saw you girls pull up alone." My heart dropped in my stomach. He had? "Are you heading out? Why don't I walk you to your car?" He starts inching towards me, and I look to Emma for help. With one swift motion, she pulled me halfway behind her and started sizing the guy up. This was pretty dumb as we were both small, and though she is a few inches taller than me, neither of us are anywhere near his size. This guy clears a 6'2" easy, but she doesn't seem to care. "Actually, we're just headed to the arcade," she says harshly. "Her boyfriend is going to meet us here." I did have a boyfriend at the time, but he wasn't coming. He wasn't even in town. I knew she knew this. The guy's face immediately changes. His smile disappeared, and he was now glaring down at me with a look of annoyance in his eyes. I felt myself start to cower. "Boyfriend," he says roughly. Emma didn't give me time to say anything. She grabbed my arm and tugged me behind her into the arcade. The boys from before had already left, and the usual girl who worked in there was nowhere to be found. But still, it felt safer than outside. We ran to the back and we hid by the claw machine. "What the hell do we do? I left my phone in the car," I whisper shouted. There was no way I was going out there alone, and that pothead go-kart guy had already disappeared into the small ticket shack. "I don't have mine either. I left it charging," she said, facepalming. "We're just gonna have to make a run for it." "Are you crazy? He's probably waiting for us in the parking lot." "What about the guy who runs the go-karts? We could get him to walk us out," she said. I just shook my head. "He's high as Mount Everest right now. I don't want to risk running all the way to the ticket stand for nothing." "Then we have no choice." She stood up, pulling me with her. "Let's go." I swallowed hard, wanting to cry. I'd never been that scared before. There was something so wrong about that guy. We made our way out of the arcade, looking around to see if he's nearby. The park was now absolutely deserted. Emma practically had to drag me to the exit. I was looking every direction every second, waiting for a guy to come out of the woods or something and pounce on us at any second. But he didn't. Everything was still. "Get your keys out," Emma instructed, and I pulled them from my pocket. We were about 20 feet from my car when I stopped dead in my tracks. "What?" she whispered. I stared at the car, keys in hand. I never locked it. "I never locked the car, Emma." "What?" "I didn't lock it. What if?" I trailed off, but she knew what I was saying. She started inching towards the car, and I grabbed her arm to stop her, but she pulled away. "I'm just gonna peek. If I say run, you run." Her voice is quiet. I nodded shakily. She eventually made it close enough to see inside, but by the way she was squinting, I knew it was too dark to make anything out. My heart was beating out of my chest. What if he's in there? What if he jumps out, or what if we get in and he asphyxiates me like in the movies? All these thoughts almost drown out the unmistakable sound of shoes slamming against the pavement. My head whipped around instantly, and there he was, sprinting at us at full speed out of the woods. I screamed bloody murder, and I broke for the car, jiggling the handle as I realized that I had locked it. Emma was already on the other side, screaming at me to unlock it. I fumbled with the keys but managed not to drop them as I unlocked the door, flung it open, and practically threw myself inside. I just managed to close the door when he was there, slamming his fist against the window and shouting incoherently. I was sobbing at this point, and I barely managed to lock the doors as he goes for the handle and yanks on it as hard as he can. Emma was screaming at me to go, and through my tears I shoved the key into the ignition and I flew into reverse. He was still chasing us and yelling as I veered backwards out of the lot and turned as fast as I could while slamming on the gas. I was driving like I was still in a go-kart, but I didn't care. I could barely see the road through the flood of tears, and Emma had to grab the wheel several times to keep us from crashing before I regained some composure. Though obviously shaken up, she had managed to keep her tears in and be the sane one out of the two of us, as we drove at least 30 miles over the speed limit the whole way back to my house. We didn't tell either of our parents about this, and looking back, I wish we had because there was something seriously wrong with this guy. But we were too scared of what they might say or do. I think we thought that they would blame us somehow. So, it stayed a secret between us. Something even we didn't talk about until months after the horrifying encounter. It's safe to say, we never went back to Miller's Fun Park after that. I'm quarantined with my mom. We're both avoiding going out when possible because we're both compromised, so we just take short trips for any errands we need to complete in order to not go stir crazy. Today, she needed to get gas and we needed a few groceries, so we both went. We saw my cousin at the gas station, and after I went to one of the pumps, I said hello while my mom went to pay for her gas. After she paid, I started pumping the gas and we all stood there chatting for a moment. When my cousin returned to the car, a man came out of the gas station. He was balding, unkempt, a patchy short beard and old glasses, the kind you see in high school photos from the 80s. He was wearing a sort of tropical shirt with a notepad and pen in the pocket, and dirty khakis and a tan jacket. He stopped at my cousin's car and talked to her. She's kind of small, so I stood there watching until she got in her car safely and I had heard it start. My mom and I were pumping the last bit of gas into the car. Both of us didn't need to do it, but we were both just glad to be outside for a moment. The guy walked to us while she was finishing up and said, "Are you having fun?" We just kind of glanced at each other and my mom said, "Uh-huh," and squatted me to make me go to the side of the car. I didn't go. I didn't want to until she was in the car herself. The guy then turned to me and said, "Are you having fun with your granddaughter?" As if he were trying to make a joke, but his facial expression never changed. I just kind of gave him a blank stare and said, "That's my mom." I squeezed between him and the bumper and moved to my side of the car. He followed closely and said, "I just came here from Michigan. I've been here for 10 years. I got in and I held onto my door. He stared at where I was holding the door and then at my face again. I was giving him that blank stare and said, "That's nice." My dog stuck his nose out and began barking at this guy. He's a 15-pound Yorkie and usually sweet, but sounded like an angry guard dog while he was barking this time. "Is the dog having fun?" the guy asked. I held onto the door tighter and said, "I guess so. Have a nice day." I closed the door quickly, locked it, and my mom drove off. My cousin drove after us. She had been watching the entire time, waiting for either us or the guy to leave. My mom and I both remarked that the guy was creepy, and we thought that he might try to jump in the car. I'm glad that I went with her today. This happened around 10 years ago in the south of the UK. For reference, I'm a 28-year-old male, and at the time, I was working part-time at a fuel station. It was on an A road which linked into a small village to a ring road into the nearby city. The village itself was quiet, high-end, and extremely expensive to live in. It was the sort of place that only had one chain store, and it was a Waitrose. Everything else was either boutiques or privately owned gourmet groceries. So, as someone who has always enjoyed cars, it was always fun to see what kind of high-end luxury sports cars would adorn the forecourt on any given day. This is where I met Michael. Michael was in his late 40s, dark hair, well-dressed, always wore Gant or Ralph Lauren, or on his workdays tailored Canali suits and so on. He was an all-around nice guy, exceptionally polite, which was actually a rarity as most of the residents of the surrounding areas seemed to despise anyone who didn't qualify for the additional tax bracket. We got chatting about his collection of vehicles or the watches that he wore. He would always show up wearing some kind of Rolex and driving his Aston Martin, Range Rover, or Porsche, so there was always a lot to talk about. I got to know that he worked in finance, and the conversation got onto what I was planning to do with my life, also to work in finance. and we would always have these pleasant conversations until I left that part-time job in favor of taking up an apprenticeship role at my uncle's brokerage. Michael is important, and we'll get to why shortly. Something to be known about my uncle is that he's a man with a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, literally. As well as his brokerage and property portfolio, he also owned a few takeaways for cash flow purposes. I think we all know what that means. And as such, I would occasionally step in as a delivery driver when a driver would let him down. Luckily, my uncle also lived in the previously mentioned village, and the main pizza place he owned catered to the residents of said village. So, tips were usually quite decent, and my uncle would usually throw me a few quid for helping out. Fast forward to the summer of 2018, and I had been roped into dropping off a few pies at a property on an extremely prestigious road. Average house price well above 1.4 million, and I'm intrigued to actually get close enough to see what these houses actually look like, as they're all gated and set far back from the road behind a shroud of trees and shrubs. So, I find the place and I buzz the intercom, when a voice comes back sort of muffled just saying, "Yes?" So I answer with the names of the takeaway, and the gates slowly open, and I make my way up the driveway to a very large mock Georgian home, complete with detached 4-car garage, and that's when I see Michael's number plates. He had his initials for his cars with the numbers 1, 2, and 3, and it was the same for his wife. I was interested to see up close the sort of life this guy had, if I'm completely honest, especially as a young aspiring financier. I exited my car, brought out the pizzas, and the double doors opened, and that's when I saw an unfamiliar face looking back at me. It was a man, early 20s maybe, thin and shaved head. I can remember he was wearing no shirt and some scruffy jeans and trainers. He was also holding something behind his back. "Hey, bring the pizzas through to the kitchen." I can remember his voice being hoarse and barely audible, and with an accent I had never heard before. Nervously, I said nothing and just looked at him, which made him visibly angry. "Bring the pizza through," he repeated, more aggressive this time, and I finally responded. "Where's Michael? This is Michael's place, right?" And it is completely true that in situations like this, your mouth goes completely dry and to always follow your gut. This guy was setting off alarm bells and telling every fiber of my being to just get off the property. Unfortunately, this is when it dawned upon me that it's a gated property and I was locked in. This is when things went from bad to worse. I can remember the terror swelling up inside of me when he moved his hand in front of him to show me a large kitchen knife, and he uttered the words, "Run." I dropped the pizza onto the gravel, left my car, and decided that I would have a better chance of survival by running down the driveway and lifting myself over the gates. They were the wooden type which had no decorative spears atop them, luckily, but all the while, I could hear his feet crunching onto the gravel behind me. I didn't look back, and I managed to pull myself up and over the gates, and hurling myself onto the pavement below me. The adrenaline in my system still had me running for what seemed like hours, but was perhaps 10 minutes at most, until I was a good few streets away and I decided to call the police. The police met me at the park that I was hiding at. One officer stayed with me, and the other proceeded to the property along with another patrol car. At first, I got the distinct impression that they didn't believe me, or thought that I was up to something, but after my uncle arrived to pick me up and vouch for me being sent there to deliver pizza, the PC in question backed down. Upon their arrival at the property, they found nothing, just my car with slashed tires and broken windows, alongside feces being smeared across part of the kitchen. There was food strewn about the place and also a needle found in one of the bathrooms, but no sign of the man who threatened me. Michael and his family at the time were visiting family in Australia, I later found out. I never did go back for another shift at the pizza place, and although I understand this may not be the most crazy or horrifying encounter, it's something that's always stuck with me. Wealth and apparent financial security is just complete illusory. People are people, and there are some sick and tormented people out there who will always find a way to carry out their twisted actions. If anything, I've had more encounters with crazy people since moving away from my council estate roots and into suburbia. When I was 18, I was living in a small town. I was friends with the ratty skaters around and helped connect with this dude who sold weed. He was 29 at the time, I think, and he gave me pretty good deals and he lived nearby. I wasn't driving at the time, so this was convenient for me. His name was Max. Max always struck me as a weird dude, but I honestly quite liked his weirdness. Not in a romantic way or anything, but I like weird people. We had normal weed buying interactions that never lasted more than 10 minutes. Buy some weed, maybe smoke a bowl, and that's it. He would often tell me that he would drop it off at my house, but I never let him because, as I said before, he was weird. I wasn't afraid of him, but was definitely aware that he and his offers to deliver were weird. One day in May 2018, I was invited to a bonfire by some ratty skaters that introduced me to this guy. I had no idea that he had been there, nor was it important to me at all. I brought the guy that I was dating at the time. I said hey to everyone, including Max. We stayed for a couple of hours and some of them played some music on their guitars. Nearing the time that I was leaving the bonfire around 11 p.m., Max was getting upset about something and he threw his guitar in the bonfire. I didn't know what he was so angry or upset about, and I paid no mind to it. This happened as I was leaving with the guy that I was dating. I went to bed and I woke up to paragraphs on paragraphs of crazy text from Max, ranging from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. Like a constant stream of text, stating things such as, "You know how much I loved you. You're cruel." He would go back and forth between saying, "I would give you the world if you let me," and "You really do deserve him though." He said really scary things like, "You are a predator and should be snubbed out. Just wait, winky face." And, "You are stuck. I will either love you or hate you to the fullest extent my powers behold. Right now, I pay the worst death on you and your frickin' boyfriend." And to top it all off, he said, "Losing you is like losing a mother to me." And he told me to tell him I never loved him and that I wouldn't hear from him again if I did. So that's what I did. I said, "I never loved you. Don't message me again." And I left it at that. I didn't get a response, nor did I care to get one. Max had never expressed any romantic interest, asked me out or anything. This was all out of nowhere and he was 11 years older than me. I was barely 18. That night, he cut his long hair off and posted photos and naked on Facebook, curled up in the fetal position talking about being a statue of shame. It's as if he had had a breakdown. But I had no intention of causing that, and I didn't think I would even offend anyone by bringing the guy that I was seeing. Everybody else seemed to like the guy that I brought. About a week later, Max texted me pretty late at night and asked if I had seen the flowers that he spread along my sidewalk, saying that he stole every flower in the vicinity of my neighborhood that night. I asked how he knew where I lived, and said that I hadn't seen the flowers, so he must have had the wrong house. I also told him that he shouldn't do that, as I never felt anything for him, and so on. He told me that he had heard that I lived on the same block as another one of the skater guys that we were both friends with, and he wasn't wrong. The skater guy that I lived by was on the other side of the block, and I never walked that way, so I never saw the flowers. I blocked his number and I didn't hear from him again for weeks. Weeks later, I woke up after a rough night, and there were loads of flowers on the sidewalk right outside my house, along with a little bouquet at the top of my walkway. I was pissed. I wasn't scared yet, and stupidly, I unblocked his number and texted him asking why the hell there were flowers outside of my house. This confirmed that this indeed was where I lived. I still to this day feel so stupid for texting him and making it known that after weeks he had found my house. He responded saying, "Sounds nice. 'Twas me." I bitched him out basically, and I blocked his number again. About a week later, I was out of town and my roommate texted me a photo of a heart with a peace sign inside of it and my name written under it, drawn in chalk outside our house. When I got back into town, I went to the courthouse and began a process of getting a stalking order against him. When I left the courthouse, I went to Max's work and told him that he needed to stop this behavior and that he was stalking me. He looked me in the eyes with no facial expression and said, "If you don't leave, I'm calling the cops." I got angry and said loudly, "Call the cops. I was just talking to them about you." And I left his work in a rage. Soon after this, I began driving my car again. I once drove by him and he noticed that it was me. The next day, I woke up to my car covered in flowers. I presented my case to the judge and she put the stalking order in place. He was served with it by police officers, and I thought that that was that, and he wouldn't be bothering me again. I was wrong. After the stalking order was served, he made several other chalk messages on my sidewalk, left random gifts for me like chalk, and beheaded my little pony heads on beer bottles. I always brought these things to the police station, but they said that I needed to catch him doing it, take a photo or get a security camera. So I got security cameras and I really hoped that I would catch him. It turned out that my camera was stupid, and I couldn't just watch the videos it took but had to skip through second by hand. It was an impossible task. I was terrified of leaving my house at night at this point. I never had my curtains open anymore, and I was so frustrated that my livelihood was being taken away from me. Ultimately, I unblocked his number in hopes that he would text me directly violating the stalking order, and after a few days, it worked. He sent me a weird text saying something like, "Forgive me. We are charming. This is harming. Let us try again." By now, it's September 2019, and he finally goes to jail. He's facing up to a year and has to stay there until our court date. I finally start calming down. I'm able to go outside at night, even if it's just to get in my car. I let myself have my curtains open sometimes. I'm starting to feel alive again. Right when I start feeling secure in my small town life again, someone posted bail, and he was released after only 3 months in jail, and I went back to living in fear. We still had court dates coming up, and I was optimistic that he would serve more time for ruining my life for so long. His lawyer kept pushing the court date back to gather evidence, and after about 6 months of pushing it back, the state decided that he wouldn't do anything more and they closed the case basically. I had moved out of town 3 hours away at this point, so he didn't actually have an option to continue this behavior. Living in this new place, I feel safe. I can walk at night. I don't have to have my curtains closed all the time. It's been over a year since they decided to close the case. About a month ago, he began responding to my friends' Instagram stories, friends that live here in this new town, telling them how fond he is of me and so on. I've always had him blocked, but my Instagram isn't private, so he must have found him that way. I have since changed my account to private and he hasn't messaged any more friends of mine. I refuse to be fearful now, the way that I was then. He will never find where I live or where I work now. However, my life is forever changed after this experience. I will always be more aware of people and their weird energy. I will always close my curtains early in the evening and make sure all the windows and doors are locked. I will always live a little bit in fear. Maybe not of him, but of it happening again. He ruined my life for a year, and I really wish that he would have had to serve that time in jail. He deserves it. So I live in an apartment complex right next to a 7-Eleven, literally a 2-minute walk from my door. So, since all this quarantine lockdown mess, I've been staying up later than usual till maybe 2 or 3 in the morning most nights. So last night, a little bit after 12, I had a taste for some chips and decided that I would go across the street to 7-Eleven, which I go to regularly. So I make my way over, and on my way in, I had to pass this man who was browsing on the Redbox kiosk. I don't think much of it. I go inside, get some snacks, pay, and then head out of the door. As I'm coming out, the Redbox man is literally staring dead at me with these scarily bright, light blue eyes. But not wanting to freak myself out even more, I say to myself, maybe he's zoned out or in deep thought. I wander into La La Land myself, sometimes so by thinking that. I was trying to make myself more comfortable having to walk past this strange man. So I'm headed back into my apartment complex, which on this side of the street has a creaky gate door. I realized that as I was walking, I never heard it slam behind me like I always had before. I look back and the man is right behind me. Not close up on me, but still, definitely following. Once again, trying to ease my mind, I'm thinking that he must be going home. But I also noticed that he didn't have any disc in his hand. For as much as he was at the kiosk the whole time I was in the store, taking my sweet, indecisive time. So not wanting to come off as scared, I keep my same pace. But I probably should have sprinted because, man, forget being nice. Anyways, I'm literally just a few steps away from my door, which is upstairs, and the man randomly calls out to me, "Hey, do you have a lighter?" Out of instinct, I turned my head to the fact I knew someone was speaking to me and responded, "No, I don't, sorry." I didn't want to go up my stairs because I didn't want to let this man know exactly which apartment that I lived in. So I was planning on walking around until I lost him. But he asked me another question. "Could I use your bathroom?" I tell him, "No, sorry, my roommates probably wouldn't be comfortable with me letting someone in this late. I don't have roommates, but I dang sure didn't want this man getting any ideas thinking that I was by myself." I keep walking, but this man was still following me. I simply ask, "Do you live around here?" And he tells me, "I have a buddy that does and he was supposed to meet me across the way there, but maybe he fell asleep or something." I've never been here before, but I do know his door is number 201. Could you help me find it? 201 is my door, plus if you had a friend that lives over here, why are you asking to use my bathroom? I knew this man was lying and up to something. I quickly came up with 201. That should be right past the pool right next to the laundry area. My friends are waiting for me, so I should get going. My gut told me to head to my car though, because what if he watched where I was going and decided to give me a surprise later on? No, I watch too many movies and read too many scary stories uploaded on here. So I started heading towards the parking lot. Not running, but definitely walking quicker than before, when I realized the man is chasing me at this point. I hurry up and pull my keys out of my pocket, and get in my car and immediately lock the doors. The man starts pounding on my driver's side window telling me to open the door. I can't help but focus on those creepy blue eyes, but I also notice that he was reaching for his pocket. I start up my car before I can see what he was going to pull out. I heard a pop, but I didn't give a crap at that moment, as long as I could get the heck out of his presence. I drove maybe 5 minutes down the street to this Arco gas station and called the police. Waiting on the police to arrive, I noticed what the popping sound was. This wacko had popped my back tire with probably a switchblade. Of course, when the police arrived and went to check the area, the random guy was gone. They did question the 7-Eleven clerk, and he let them know that the man had been up there a few times since last week, and never has been a problem but is obviously homeless. I'm still shook up about what went on last night, and I'm going to chill on the late night trips to 7-Eleven for a little bit. To the messed up Redbox man, let's not meet again. But if we do, I have a taser for you on its way from Amazon. Try me. It was probably only after my close call that my mind really started to run away with what could have happened were it not for my dog. I'm a 26-year-old female. I live with my fiance and my 2 cats and my dog, Rowan. Our house is literally less than a minute away from a huge farmer's field that is frequented by many dog walkers at all times of the day. Me and my significant other often take turns walking Rowan around the field throughout the day. It was only around 7:30 p.m. and it was still really bright and sunny. Rowan was letting me know that it was time to go for a walk, so while my partner was tinkering in the garage, I grabbed his leash and headed to the field. Let me quickly tell you about Rowan. He's a 2-year-old Rottweiler who is very loving and playful, if a little daft, but he wouldn't hurt a fly. There's not a bad bone in his body. He is also extremely well trained, and we made sure to put the effort in as he's a big dog breed with a bad rep, so we wanted to make a point of not feeding stereotypes. I'm very much of the opinion of there's no bad dogs, just bad owners. Unfortunately, we've had some run-ins with some not so good dog owners, so Rowan gets a little nervous when he meets new dogs and people, but we're working on it. Anyway, back to the story. We're walking around the farmer's field. Rowan is off sniffing and peeing on every blade of grass in sight. I always keep an eye out for other walkers anyway due to Rowan being a little nervous, and I clocked a guy on his own walking down the path towards me fairly far away. At first I thought nothing of it, as plenty of people walk this route without dogs. We were just kind of getting into lockdown in the UK though. As the guy got closer, I noticed he was in a full tracksuit with the hood up, which was odd because it was like 23 degrees, so shorts and t-shirt weather. He then took a small path off the field leading through some bushes. It was a public-made shortcut rather than an official public footpath, but it was well enough used, so I kept walking, thinking nothing of it. At about 15 meters away from the path he took, Rowan shot back to my side immediately, dropping the mouthful of dirt he had been pretending not to eat. He's not the brightest. I petted him and noticed that he was standing super alert, staring at the path entrance. When I looked up, I caught a glimpse of the man peeking around the edge of the bushes that had concealed the entrance. I stopped dead in my tracks and Rowan's fur was stood on end as he positioned himself in front of me. It took me a second to realize that this man had been watching and waiting in the bushes for me to approach. My current route would have meant that I would be walking right by the path's opening. My stomach dropped as I realized we were the only ones around on that field. I had this weird moment where I was almost trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, but then the guy whistled. Not a wolf whistle, but as if to try and get my dog to come to him. Rowan was having none of that though, and I definitely took it as my cue to trust my stranger danger instincts. I immediately turned and sped walked back the way that we came, while simultaneously pulling my phone out and dialing my partner's number. I ended up having to clip on Rowan's lead to get him to walk with me, and he was not taking his eyes away from the path. He was even growling a little, which was so out of character and put me on edge even more. I glanced back and the man had edged slightly out of the bushes, watching me walk away. My partner answered the phone after a few rings. I was only halfway through stammering out the story and he was already sprinting up to the field to meet me, telling me to stay on the phone but keep an eye on the man. The man in the tracksuit now fully came out of the bushes and just stood staring at me, walking away. I dared a quick look away from him towards the entrance to the field, to see my fiancée jogging towards me. He was relieved that I was okay, but was also immediately pointing and shouting, "Is that him?" Clearly furious at what this man might have had in mind, had Rowan not picked up on him hiding in the bushes. I eventually convinced my fiancée not to confront him, as he was still stood staring, almost taunting us. You never know what people might be capable of or have concealed. We came off the field and took Rowan on a different walk, which he was more than happy about. I've never been so proud of Rowan for stepping up and protecting me. Safe to say, he got plenty of treats and fussing when we got home. So, creepy man in the bushes, let's not meet. I've had a stalker for over 2 years. I'm a 27-year-old female, and have worked with people with disabilities since I was 19. I was born with a rare genetic condition, and have been using my experience as a radical disability activist and advocate to help other people with disabilities in my community. During my time working in the disability community, I have been sexually harassed and assaulted several times by both men and women, When I first started working with the organization, I was working with my best friend's older brother, her older sister, and several of her aunts, uncles, and cousins. So in the beginning, I always felt safe. Like people would do anything to keep the creeps away from me. They would have. However, after several years, all my close friends slowly started leaving. Flash forward to a couple of years ago, when most of my closest friends were all gone, leaving me one of the most experienced and senior staff members, including all of the management and the board of directors. I've had a lot of bad experiences in these past 2 years, with the stuff stated above, but the worst part has been the lack of support from management. So, within the last few years, a client that we'll call Leonard, a male in his 50s, started to chat with me at community events. We often have parties or events that we invite the entire community to. From the very first moment that I met Leonard, I experienced chills creeping up and down my spine. Something about the way that he looked at me has always made me super uncomfortable, to the point that I'll do literally anything to get away from him, including helping folks in the bathroom. He's a really short white guy with shocking white hair and these clear blue eyes that are just empty. He's always really smiley and soft-spoken. He started off innocent enough. He would corner me at parties and talk until I found a reason to slip away. But at some point, he managed to get my personal cell phone number from a coworker, I still don't know who, and started calling me late at night and leaving long, rambling messages. I never answered the phone, and after a while, he stopped. He would still periodically call me though, despite me asking him politely in person to stop. He started cornering me in the office too, when no one was around, so I had a difficult time getting away from him. Every time that he cornered me, he would grab my arm or shoulder so I couldn't leave. More recently, like during the lockdown, he started calling the office and leaving messages on my work phone after hours. He wasn't even someone that I personally worked with. I asked my coworker who did work with him to please ask him to stop, and which she did. She spoke to him several times, but he would only ever stop for a week or two. And he always made a point to come and apologize directly to me, which almost always made me more uncomfortable. It started to get really bad about 3 weeks before I started working from home. He would forget his appointments, which were purposefully set on the one day in the week when I wasn't working in the office. He would come in the next day when he knew that I was working, and then he figured out when I got off, and would come in to meet with my coworker right before I got off work and to wait around until my shift ended. He started giving me little gifts, which I always refused. Every time he would get really offended, so then he started writing me poetry. Instead of just handing it to me, he would grab me and read over my shoulder and point out what every single line meant. I always tried to get other coworkers to help me, but no one saw anything as weird or bad or unsafe, despite the warning bells going off in my head. And then one day he cornered me and said he wanted to take me to the train station, because I usually walked. I asked him if he meant he wanted to walk me the 2 blocks. He shook his head and said, "No, I want to take you in my car so I can keep a better eye on you." It gave me instant chills. I told him no, but he kept insisting that it would happen before he finally left. I'm a tiny petite person, so the idea that he was following me long enough to know exactly which train station that I went to, and the line that I got on. There are several different lines going in several different directions, and even the direction that I was going really freaked me out. Enough to double up on the defensive measures I normally keep on me, including pepper spray and a taser. I told everyone. I told supervisors, HR, the associate director, everyone that I could think of. I had meetings with my direct supervisors where I explained everything that happened and why he was giving me the creeps. But they all just brushed me off, and one manager in particular said I was being too dramatic. He was just a sweet older man, doing nothing to harm anyone. Until the next time he came around. I told a couple of my coworkers, J and P, a 28-year-old male and a 26-year-old male, and they both agreed that one of them would always walk me out from now on. On cue, Leonard waited around until after I got off. But Jay and P, who said they had looked out for me, were both super busy. So the associate director said he would walk me out, still not believing that it was a big deal. We started walking and chatting like old friends, and the whole time, Leonard followed us. The associate director had to literally yell at him to finally get Leonard to leave. Right then, he finally realized how serious the situation was getting. The next day, one of the managers, who was super rude and dismissive about the whole situation, pulled me into her office and profusely apologized. After Leonard was yelled at and went back to the office, the manager had a conversation with him that really creeped her out on my behalf. Apparently he was saying things like, "My relationship with me is ours and has nothing to do with the organization. You have no right to tell me how to behave around me. She likes me and likes what I'm doing. I'm not making her uncomfortable. She needs me to watch out for her." That same day, the entire management team apologized for not taking immediate action. Especially since this is not the first time stuff like this has happened to me. I just asked that from now on, I have absolutely no contact with him. I reiterated several times that I absolutely do not want an apology. I want nothing. Since then, I've learned that Leonard has harassed and assaulted an old coworker who had to file a restraining order against him. This was told to me by the manager who originally dismissed my claims. She had dealt with the other situation, yet nothing was told to any of the other staff about this behavior. And not only that, she berated me in front of other staff for speaking out about my experience, saying that it wasn't that big of a deal, even though she knew he had done it before. If I never have to see that guy again, I will be eternally grateful. The situation was never fully resolved before lockdown. I'm very thankful I've been able to work from home, but I'm not sure how to proceed after restrictions are lifted, and I have to start going back out again. I was thinking about filing a restraining order. My husband and family really want me to, but I pretty much figured out that no one will take me seriously. This happened about 2 weeks ago. I was walking my dog on the normal route. Normally, I would be at 6th form studying my A-levels. However, as we all know, schools are closed. Due to the lockdown, the streets were very quiet. I was about 20 minutes from home when I clocked 2 men in a beaten-up blue van, driving past, staring and leering at me. Nothing too worrying, this happens a lot. However, I soon did start to worry. Obviously, the van is going to be going at a faster pace than me walking. So the van would drive, pause, wait for me to catch up and then drive a little bit ahead. Pause, wait for me to catch up, and it would keep repeating this. I thought perhaps they were looking for an address, but they seemed focused on me and my journey, and nobody was getting out of the van to do deliveries. I know the van that does the deliveries in this area, and this was not that van. I crossed the road so I was on the opposite side to the van in case they tried to grab me. I had a gut instinct they wanted to keep me within their sights while they worked up the courage and waited for the right opportunity to get me. While the van had gotten a few meters ahead, as they were waiting for me, and it was at an angle to their wing mirrors, they wouldn't see me, I ducked behind some hedges. Normally, I would have phoned my parents by this point. However, both of them are key workers and would not be able to leave their work. This left me at a vulnerable position, as I didn't want these two men knowing where I lived, where I was home alone. So I resisted the urge to sprint the last 5 minutes home. Me and my dog hid in the bushes for a while. The van drove past a few times and the men were peering out, but they didn't see me. I went home after I felt like they were gone, and thankfully they had. I checked the number plate when I got home, and I believe it was a fake as there were no matches. My dad grew up on forestry in Queensland, Australia, as the son of a forest ranger. My whole life, we've spent a lot of time out in that forest, camping and driving through parts of the forestry that only rangers would travel, and only occasionally. One place that Dad loved to take us was a little farm in the middle of the forest that was impossible to find if you didn't know the way. Locals knew the place as Spike's Hut. Spike was a local farmer who had lived there for decades up until the 90s, and had a reputation for being abrasive, violent, bigoted, and not concerned with the laws of men. He had a habit of approaching guys in bars who were wearing earrings and tearing them straight out, and there were a few stories about people who displeased him disappearing. Basically, Spike was not a nice guy, and his farm and hut reflected that pretty well. Dad would take us out there every time we visited the forest, and the hut would be more and more dilapidated, but the vibe was always the same. That straight up feeling of being watched, even though Spike was long gone. As I got older, I became more aware of the signs of life in the place where we went to visit. There would be 44-gallon drums full of smashed beer bottles, fire pits with reasonably fresh coals. Someone was definitely out there. God knows why, since the place was literally a snake pit at that point. But Dad didn't seem concerned. One trip when I was a teenager, it got really strange really quick. My friends and I were all piled into my dad's 4x4, and we were driving through the bush to Spike's so Dad could tell his scary Spike stories and freak us out. We drove onto the property, and something immediately caught my eye. Up on the hill opposite Spike's hut, there was what appeared to be a cowboy slumped against a log, hat over his face, taking a nap. Something about his body position looked unnatural and uncomfortable. It wasn't the way that you would be sad if you were taking a casual nap in the middle of a workday. And even if it was, there was no reason for anyone to be out there. The farm was long defunct, and there was no forest business to be taken care of on the property. I pointed it out to my dad, and instead of letting us out of the car at Spike's as he usually did, he said he wanted to keep driving through the farm to show us something. He maintained that it was nothing, but that if the figure was still there when we came back through, we would stop and check it out. Of course, whatever he wanted to show us seemed totally made up, as he just drove through the forest a bit. And when we came back, I spotted the slumped over cowboy again, never having moved an inch, still in that same unnatural position. I yelled out to Dad to stop, reminding him of his promise, but instead he acted like he couldn't hear me. He locked the truck doors and drove off the farm much faster than he ever drove on those dirt forest roads. My friends and I all looked at each other in confusion, but we knew that when it came to this area, questioning my dad was futile at best, dangerous at worst. Dad denied that any of the events of that day ever happened after that, but my friends and I were still really curious about what was going on out there. So, a few months later, we went camping on our own and set out to find Spike's hut. It took hours of driving through the forest to find the gate to Spike's property, but eventually we found it without Dad's help. Something was off once we got there, more so than usual that day though. My mates jumped out of the car but were suddenly frozen, not wanting to walk any closer to the hut, for no visible reason. The vibe was just wrong that day, and it felt like we had walked into something that didn't belong to us. The tug in my gut to get out was strong, but I had spent 2 hours finding the place and I was going to explore it. One of my friends acted brave and walked from the car to the hut with me, quietly acknowledging more and more signs of inhabitants with knowing nods between us. We said nothing to the others, but we were on high alert. It felt like someone could be back any minute, or that they had never left and were watching us as we poked around the debris. We walked up to the side of the hut to find a kind of a small shed with 3 walls. I heard my friend's voice go squeaky as he called me over to look inside. On the ground was a huge pile of ashes from what looked like a cooking fire, and confirming this was the presence of a giant makeshift grill, made from crosshatched wire, sitting over the fire, hinged to the shed wall. As I'm looking at this setup, I figure that whoever had been there had been hunting and cooking large chunks of their kill over the fire. Pretty clever actually. But then my stomach dropped. As my eyes traveled down the grill to the ground, I saw a baby sock. tiny, pink, and terribly out of place. And then another, and then a shirt, and then a ribbon from a child's hair, all sitting right beside the ashes on the ground, next to a woman's weekly Christmas cookbook. That's when the alarm bells in my head went off and I rounded up my mates to get the heck out of there. Some ranger or crazy old bushy hanging out at that trash top was one thing, but there was absolutely no reason for a baby to be out there. And there's no way anything good had come of having a child's clothing right by a huge fire and grill. When we got back to the campground, we couldn't shake the rotten feeling of being watched, and all of us were so unsettled that we packed up our stuff and decided not to stay the night. When I got home, I told my dad about it, and he just shook it off, saying weird stuff happens out there. Being young and dumb, I never thought to look up missing persons in the area in an attempt to explain either the cowboys or the kids' clothing. But I can tell you that I will never make the mistake of going out to Spike's without my father again. Let's start with a little backstory. I'm a 24-year-old female that fell in love with national parks, so much so that I decided to work full-time on one for about 3 years. This experience allowed me to meet some great people, but it also welcomed some sketchy individuals. This particular story starts with a man that we'll call Sam. Sam was a tall man with a shaved head and glasses. He was the kind of coworker that would always linger awkwardly. He made everyone feel uncomfortable, but not enough to warrant any concern. The only issue that I really noticed was that he seemed like he had a drinking problem. He would show up to work still drunk, and he would have to be sent home somewhat regularly. He seemed innocent though, in a socially awkward way. I only worked with him for a few months before I was transferred to another location, and I was offered a pay raise. A few months after starting the new position, I was in the employee break room browsing my newsfeed when I received 5 messages within a 3-minute time span. I didn't even realize people could type that fast. The messages were from Sam. Something that caught me off guard because I had never spoken to him outside of my last position. The messages consisted of vague threats regarding my friends and myself. He seemed upset to find out that I had certain friends and thought that I was tainted from association. I was less upset at his foul perception of me and more pissed that he had targeted my friends, who were truly lovely people. I am bad when it comes to taking the high road, and I decided to give this man a piece of my mind. We weren't friends, hardly acquaintances, so I didn't feel that his behavior was appropriate, and quite frankly, I was angry. Through our exchange, the original rude context of the messages became obviously threatening. He told me that I should die along with my friends, and that he would be more than happy to end our misery. I was shocked. His anger didn't make sense to me, and I realized that I wasn't going to reason with this lunatic, so I decided to get HR involved. We worked within the same company, so I thought this would be the best route to prevent any further harassment. HR advised me to block contact from him while they investigate, but to also alert authorities in case he decided to act out on his threats. Authorities were involved and didn't seem too fazed by the messages that I'd showed them. They almost seemed annoyed that I'd bothered calling them in the first place. I filled out a statement and was told to contact them if anything progressed. The next day, I woke up to find trash all over my front steps. Odd, but not too strange. I actually thought it was a raccoon since I was in a national park. And then I saw a piece of paper with the words, "Watch your back," scribbled onto it. I looked around the other neighboring cabins to see if anybody else was watching, but I didn't see anyone. I cleaned up the mess, but I saved the note. I wanted to show my sister who lived with me. When she got home later that morning, I caught her up on the previous night's events. She didn't even know Sam because, like I said, we weren't friends. Why would I mention him in my personal life? I gave her a brief description of him in case she saw him lurking around, and I headed to work. Halfway through my shift, I get a call from Alexa. She sounds shaken when she tells me that a man matching Sam's description came to our cabin and asked about me and where I was. She played dumb and pretended to not even know who I was. After an awkward silence, he said, "I'll be back to get her later," and he walked away. She said that he sounded and acted like he had been heavily drinking and had an intense coldness to him. I'm not messing around at this point, and I've watched enough crime shows to know that you should not underestimate people. So, I called the company's security team and asked to have someone check on my sister and to be escorted home immediately. I'm home within 20 minutes of her phone call. She gave security some more information and they were able to find out which cabin that he resided in. Apparently, he only lived about a 2-minute walk down our street, which was really unnerving. Park rangers are called again, and they get more statements from both of us and decide to pay him a visit. They seem to be taking the situation a bit more seriously now that he knows where I live. They come back after talking to his roommate. It's confirmed that he lives there, but he hasn't been home since the night before. Authorities put a word out to keep an eye out for Sam. They offer to have a unit keep an eye on us that night, which we gladly accept, and we go to bed. I wake up to 34 messages from an unknown number. It was Sam again. He was very angry that I got HR and other rangers involved. He said, "You're going to pay for this. You messed with the wrong person. I'll end you." I email HR and present them screenshots of the messages and texts. I demand that they resolve this immediately and want to set up a meeting with the director to discuss termination. You see, in national parks when you're hired, the company provides cheap housing on site, and when you're fired, you have to leave the national park boundary within 24 hours. So, I thought this would solve a majority of the issues. They seemed to agree with me and tried to locate Sam for a meeting. No one had seen him since the first messages began 2 days prior, so the park is on a manhunt. The park is huge, and it's easy to hide if you don't want to be found. Thankfully though, his roommate alerted officials when Sam stumbled home drunk the next day. They're able to speak with him and sober him up enough to take him to the HR building a couple of hours later. After the meeting, I'm notified that he had been given a first and final write-up and will continue to work and live on my street. He apparently gave a sob story about his personal issues and promises to leave me alone. I was baffled that even with him threatening to kill me, they weren't going to fire him. Thankfully, the other rangers were equally surprised and still offered to provide surveillance just in case. It was quiet for 3 days. I thought it was actually over and I started to feel bad for Sam actually. I thought maybe he was just going through some stuff and I was just his mental punching bag. I didn't agree with it, but I no longer felt as threatened, if that makes sense. That was until I received a knock on my door and I opened it to find 2 rangers waiting to speak with me. According to the rangers and a few people from the HR department, Sam's roommate had to call the emergency line when Sam started acting bizarre after the meeting and tried to convince him to lure me into a secluded place so Sam could take care of me. Thankfully, his roommate wasn't a psycho and reported the situation immediately once Sam went to the bathroom. Rangers were on site within minutes and had restrained Sam in order to search their cabin for evidence. They ended up finding a loaded firearm and a suspected suicide note that stated he was going to kill me and take his own life. There was plenty of evidence for the case and he was successfully banned from all national parks in the United States. I have since moved to a different state and have changed my contact information. He has since contacted me once to brag about how much I helped him secure unemployment benefits, which I quickly shared with officials. According to officials, he is restricted to a southern Arizona county due to other crimes that he had later committed, and that I shouldn't worry about him finding me. As for HR, the director actually had to deal with harassment from Sam after the banning and asked me to testify on her behalf if it turned into something more sinister. I haven't heard anything since, so I'm assuming she found another way to stop his assault. I don't understand why he decided to target me. We hadn't had very many interactions even at work. I have tried to dig through memories to find a single time that I may have invited this kind of behavior, but I'm convinced it was due to many factors. including his instability and alcoholism. I was a wildland fighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally popular with a lot of recreation in the northern portion, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was on had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked out of, and one that was about 2.5 hours away up a really windy, mountainous road. The report duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station, and a new double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, I had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, we were playing horseshoes and watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made people play on their phones, but I digress. So, for my story, I want to keep it pretty simple, but my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things as well as working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting a weird mucusy drop of liquid on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me that he wasn't below any trees, so it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there ever again, which leads me to believe that he was telling the truth. Now for my story. I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of July 4th, and we weren't on duty, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a PT hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I started dozing off, but I felt awake still, and I hear one of my coworkers outside my window asking me to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by the window. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from outside. They kept beckoning me, and I said no. Pretty quickly, their voice started changing to a deeper, raspier, angrier voice. They started cursing at me. "Get outside!" I just froze. It was sort of a demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving while they yelled at me. Eventually, it finally stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my coworker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was just a mild form of sleep paralysis, but I'm not so sure. A little bit of background about myself. I've worked my entire adult life in the Pacific Northwest woods. Over 15 years in total, with about 7 years of that being for the Park Service at Olympic National Park. Many experiences over the years could warrant the title of creepy, but this one in particular has always stuck with me. While working for the Park Service, one of my jobs was that of a restoration carpenter. We would travel to old, backcountry historical cabins, emergency shelters, homesteads, and chalets, tasked with repairing and restoring them to their original, historic, accurate states. This was a wonderful and demanding job. I had spent 8 days at the time living off the beaten path, usually deep in the backcountry. Sometimes we would be flown in supplies. Sometimes we would use llamas or mules to pack our gear, all the while sleeping in thinly walled single tents, cooking over a fire or a whisper-light stove, using these same tools and techniques the original homesteaders had at their disposal in the late 1800s to construct and survive in this unforgiving environment. One night fall, I was assigned to work near Lake Ozette at an old homestead off the trail, near the constructed boardwalk. For those unfamiliar with the area, Lake Ozette is 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. It sits as the largest unaltered national lake in Washington. Lake Ozette has a long and rich history of Native American culture. The Maka Tribal Center in Nia Bay houses discoveries found in the area dating back 2,000 years, along with a local village that was well preserved over 300 years ago by a mudslide that left most of the artifacts intact. The Ozette Loop Trail, which the homestead was directly adjacent to, is approximately 9.4 miles through and through. The man-made boardwalk takes you under giant cedar groves, meanders through huge patches of chest-high salal, before delivering you to Alstrom's Prairie, about 2.5 miles from the trailhead. Alstrom's Prairie, a giant, soggy meadow, was once farmed by 2 Swedish immigrants. They constructed a small cabin and some outbuildings on the 150-acre bog. With cattle, sheep, vegetable gardens, and the help of a little Swedish ingenuity, they managed to etch out lives for themselves here for over 50 years. Over time, the forest, as it always does, decided to take back what was once its own. The now decades-long abandoned farm was hardly recognizable. Our job was to beat back the encroaching forest, put new windows in the main cabin, pipe in a new stove, apply fresh paint, and fix up portions of the semi-dilapidated barn. The ultimate goal being to allow guided tours to take place sometime in the future. For about 3 weeks, we stayed at the Ozette bunkhouse while working at Alstrom's. This was good duty for us. We weren't sleeping under the rain, our beds were warm. Our hike was short and the terrain not difficult. We even had a TV. The bunkhouse was located near the highway and the ranger station. We would hike the 5-mile loop every day, bringing with us boards, tools, paint, and everything else that we needed on our backs. These were full 10-plus hour days, usually starting our morning hike around 7 a.m. and beginning our evening return hike back to the bunkhouse around 5 p.m. At one point during the fall, there were 4 of us working this project, but at the time of this event, there was only 2 of us remaining. Most of the hard work had already been finished. We needed to hike a few last boards into the prairie to complete a portion of the woodshed before we called the job done. I volunteered to be the pack mule for the day, my only job being to carry as many boards as I could muster in each trip to the prairie before returning to the ranger station for the next load. It was late in the season for hikers at this point. The weather had turned and we had been lucky to see 2 to 3 people a day doing the loop. After around my 4th or 5th trip, I was pretty wiped out. It was getting late in the evening now, around 4 p.m., and my coworker had called it a day. I thought I could get one more trip in before it got too dark. My rationale being the more trips I did today, the less I would have to do tomorrow. We passed on the trail. I told him my intentions and I continued on. I delivered the last of the boards for the day, took a look around the prairie as the sun started to tuck behind the trees, and I started my hour hike back to the ranger station. The lighting on the boardwalk was quite low at this point, the cedars blocking most of the ambient light left by the setting sun, and making visibility quite diminished. I'm not a nervous hiker, and I fail to spook easily. Having solo hiked for weeks on end in the backcountry, I'd been stalked by cougars, confronted by Kodiak bears in Alaska, even ran into a few demented hillbillies over the years. As I left the prairie that evening, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Goosebumps erupted from my forearms. An uneasy feeling swept over me. Suddenly, I wanted to walk faster, jog, and then sprint. I didn't. I convinced myself that I had been reading too many fantasy novels before bedtime. I walked another 5 minutes or so before I started to hear something faint. Something that sounded like music. Impossible, I told myself. I'm the only one out here, and still at least 2 miles from civilization. That civilization in reality being like the only other soul out there, my coworker. Sure enough, however, I heard music. More specifically, a piano. It started out so faint that I had to stop moving and actually try to hear it. The steps on the wooden boardwalk being too loud. Every time I paused to hear it, it became unmistakable. It got louder. I stood there, the sun now fully hidden behind the horizon, in total silence other than this piano. I became aware that there were no longer the noise of life, no birds, no insects, no wind, no rustling of leaves or underbrush, absolutely nothing other than the piano. As if everything was being weighted down by a fog of emptiness of some sort. I've encountered this dead time before in the woods. Certain places have it, but this was different somehow. unique to this place, unique to this moment in time. I tried to focus on the keys, but I could not recognize the composition. Unsurprising, as I mostly listened to Metallica and Korn at the time. It was playing with a purpose. It was controlled, in tune, thoughtful. It was a song, and somehow I felt that it was meant just for me in this moment. I started walking again. Almost on cue, the music once again got louder. As my pace increased, so did the tempo of my keys, still in tune, never faltering. It reached the climax, the perfect combination of my haste, my dread, my heartbeat, and the tempo of the music. And then as quickly as it came, the piano stopped, whooshed away in the fraction of a moment. It didn't trail off, it didn't fade into extinction. It was just gone. Suddenly, everything that was absent was swept away as if by a gust of wind. The stillness was gone. The gloom, the stagnation, and weight of everything was lifted. My next step on the boardwalk was once again in reality. The evening was just as absent of light as before, but it felt like life somehow was once again injected back into the forest. The woods never seemed normal again. I didn't hear the piano again that night, nor since. I told my coworker every detail when I had reached the bunkhouse. He showed no signs of disbelief. We didn't talk about it again until years later, when something similar happened to another Park Service employee. When I told my grandfather about what had happened, as he was also a retired park ranger who had worked nearby at Mora, the next station over. Without the least bit of hesitation, he asked, "Did you hear the bagpipes along with it, or just the piano this time?" It seems, as I've learned and experienced since then, there is a lot more to that place, a lot more to the Olympics in general, than anyone really knows or is willing to admit. For some background information, I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. I had decided to start my undergrad studies in a small college town in Montana. Anyways, due to many financial pitfalls, my family and I decided that me moving back home and going to school locally would be our best bet. The academic year wrapped up and my mom flew down to meet me for our road trip through Canada, before re-entering the US on the Alaskan side. Of course, because I had intended on living in Montana for 4 years, there was a lot of junk in my car weighing it down, so I wasn't so keen on speeding through unfamiliar roadways. The first day or so was great. My mom and I stopped here and there to do some shopping in a few larger Canadian cities. Overall, we made a point of traveling mostly during daylight hours, but during the early mornings and evenings, I usually drove. My mom had eye surgery a year or so before all of this, so her eyesight tends to be not so great at night. So on the third night I'm driving us to our hotel in Dawson, Yukon, and things are going fine. We are a bit behind schedule and it's getting dark faster than I would have liked though. Somewhere after Stewart Crossing, we end up with this guy tailgating us with his high beams on. I'm kind of annoyed because I was already going nearly 10 kilometers over the speed limit. So I moved to the side and I waited for the guy to go around me. I would like to point out that this was a single lane, two-way road with nearly no traffic. Despite me getting out of the way and waiting for this guy to go around, he seems to mimic my movements, staying right behind me even as I move almost off the road. By now, I begin to feel this heavy, cold feeling in the pit of my gut, and my mom begins panicking. As I've said before, the woman's as blind as a bat in the dark, and I'm having a fairly hard time making out anything in the mirrors with these guys' high beams blinding me. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a make or model of the vehicle, let alone a license plate number or anything about the driver. This all continued on for a while. I dropped down to the speed limit, sort of putting my foot down and saying, if this guy wants to speed, it could have very well been a woman for all I know. They can go around, in a sense. But still, the tailgating and high beaming continued, even as other people passed and flashed their high beams at this person. We were maybe 10 or so kilometers outside of Arlington when things escalated. As we were getting closer to civilization, Arlington at least, my mom told me to just speed up and lose him. The driver suddenly sped up as if sensing that I was now actively fleeing and attempted to ram us from the rear driver's side. It might have been sheer luck that they missed or that I accelerated faster than them. As all of this was happening, my mom was attempting to get a call through to the emergency services, only neither of our phones had a signal. We had a local carrier, and even in Montana, the service was terrible. By now, I'm easily breaking the speed limit by at least 20 kilometers an hour, when the engine behind me revs up and the vehicle, a large SUV I now realize, zips around us and suddenly slams their brakes with their vehicle diagonal to us. I slammed my brakes in response and nearly lost control as I drove almost entirely off the road. In the passenger seat, my mom is screaming hysterically, but I barely noticed at the time. In front of me, I can make out several figures in the SUV, only I wasn't terribly focused on much. All I remember was practically seeing red before shifting into reverse and hitting the gas, before shifting back into drive and speeding forward. I narrowly missed the back end of the SUV in the escape. After that, I wasn't entirely sure what happened. I was speeding off and the vehicle was still following, but further back. As we pulled into Arlington, they disappeared into some side street, and my mom and I debated going to the police. We stopped at the first place with lights on, a hotel, and my mom ran in to use the phone. I waited in the car, trembling from the rush and anxious in case that SUV was still prowling around. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe just some teenagers who didn't understand driver etiquette or how to drive around someone. Maybe it was some prank. I consider it might have been insurance related, but they seemed more interested in forcing me off the road than making me hit them. In the end, nothing was or could be done by the local police, so my mom and I hurried along to Dawson, alone and slightly paranoid. When we got back, we agreed not to share this with my dad, because he was already controlling and paranoid enough as it is. I suppose his paranoia is not without reason, since if things had gone differently, I might not be here to share this story with you all. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. Sometimes we would go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colors of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me that he was going to grab us some food and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing that I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild gray hair, almost shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looked like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was wearing ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. Several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulders, crooked, like she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly. She was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. and then her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this is when I felt the first tinge of something wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door, because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched, as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face or trying to fix her mess of hair or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way out to the door. I heard it open and then slam close. The door was pretty heavy and it slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock. And then I paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silent as I could manage to confirm what I had just thought I heard. Yes, breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point, I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she left, only to stick around and be quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong. So I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time, it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside and I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked if I was okay, since I had taken much longer than usual, and I said that I would tell him all about it once we were far away from that store. This happened only a couple of nights ago, and I'm still really shaken up, so I apologize if my story seems all jumbled up. I'm still processing this. A couple of nights ago, my boyfriend and I took a brief road trip down to a neighboring state to see Sam Smith. Before we left, I was working 10 days straight at my job and getting about 4 to 5 hours of sleep a night. So I was super exhausted and very easily upset over small things. This may be important to note later. The drive there was fine, albeit exhausting, but we made it to our hotel with plenty of time to spare. We decided to shower and get some food before leaving the hotel for the concert, and I decided that we would Uber since the concert was in a downtown area that I had never been to before, and I also knew traffic was going to be ridiculous. And considering I'm running on fumes at this point, I decided Ubering wouldn't be a terrible idea. Our Uber driver arrives and the ride there is pleasant. We get to the concert venue and easily find our seats, and then the show begins. I wanted to take a lot of videos on my phone, but I only managed a few, as my phone was at 10%, and I knew that I would need to contact an Uber and pay, so I turned it off. The concert ends, and after battling through the crowd to get outside, I turned my phone on. It's now only at 7%, so I can call an Uber. It's now about 11 p.m. As this was my first time, I wasn't expecting prices to jump ridiculously high. So my boyfriend suggested that we walk around the block or so and check downtown while we wait. I agree and we walk. About 30 minutes later, we stopped by the entrance to a small courtyard or park about a half a block away from a gas station. My boyfriend tells me to book an Uber, but my phone dies before I can. Being the paranoid, anxious, and easily stressed woman that I am, I start to have a panic attack. Like a full-on shaking, crying, can't breathe enough or slow down my breathing, sweaty, heart-pounding panic attack. I begin to overthink that we are now stranded downtown with no way home. I thought about getting a cab or the bus, but I had no cash on me and it was getting late. My boyfriend, bless his soul, is much more logical and rational when dealing with stressful situations, and suggested that we go to a gas station and see if we can get a charger for my phone and plug it in there. I can barely talk or walk at this point, and my body is physically just not functioning. So he helps me sit down on the bench and tells me that I'll be right back and not to go anywhere. Nothing sketchy happens while he's gone, and when he comes back, he helps me to the gas station and lets me know that he told the police officer in there what had happened. The officer was really understanding, and he basically bought a charger for us and stood by my phone until it booted up. After taking some deep breaths, I get my phone and I try to get an Uber. This is when I'm told that I have no money in my debit card. Now, I begin to panic more. Here we are, alone in a more shady part of downtown, with bars on the windows of a gas station at night with no money and no way to get home. Again, my rational boyfriend reminds me that I have a credit card, and after checking the balance, I have just enough for the Uber and gas for my own car when we leave. So I book another Uber. It says he's about 5 or so minutes away, so I calm down a little, but not much. I tell my boyfriend that I'm gonna step outside to get air into my lungs, and he tells me that he'll be right out. He's going to get me a water. There was a very long line in the gas station, and with all the people staring at me, I didn't want to be in there any longer than I had to be. So I went outside and I stood by the ice machine. This is when things started to go bad. A few moments later, a white car with its windows rolled down parks in the parking lot of the gas station. There are 2 rough-looking guys in the car, one white with what I think is brown hair and stubble, the other black with dark blue or maybe a gray or black shirt on wearing a hat. And I feel them staring at me while I try to get my breathing under control. At this point, my hands have gone numb, and I'm finding it difficult to keep my balance. I just wanted to get home. And then 2 other guys came around the corner and walked over to the car. They talked for a little and exchanged glances in my direction, and I hear them laughing about how messed up and strung out I was. I guess they thought that I was high on something and either having a bad trip or coming down, and I didn't blame them. I felt really terrible, and I'm sure that I looked the part. I just tried to ignore them, and when my hands were shaking so bad, I would check my phone to see how close the Uber was. Now he was 3 minutes away. I glanced through the barred window and see my boyfriend only a few people away from the front of the line, so I feel like everything will be fine. But I was wrong. The 2 guys who were outside of the car started catcalling me and trying to get my attention, and I continued ignoring them. And then they started coming towards me. I knew I should have moved or said something or done something, but I was frozen. My throat was closing up, and I felt the panic coming back again. They continued catcalling and asked what I was doing alone, asking where I was going, what I was on, and so on. One of them started touching my arm and getting really close, and I barely mumbled out that I wanted them to leave me alone. They laughed it off and said that they could take me where I needed to go, and I felt them starting to pull me towards the car where the guys were waiting. I tried fighting them off, but I was so weak. I could barely walk or stand on my own. I felt like I was going to vomit. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I kept mumbling that I wanted them to let me go and leave me alone, but they didn't listen or didn't care. They just kept saying that we were all going to have fun. I felt one of them grabbing my butt and squeezing it. We were right at the car. The smell of pot and cigarettes and alcohol filling my lungs as one of the back doors opened, and I couldn't do anything. I felt so stupid. I felt like I deserved this because I couldn't fight back. I tried one last time to break free, but their hands were like claws digging into my skin. Just as I was about to be shoved into the car, I heard a familiar voice shout, "Hey, what are you doing?" along with footsteps approaching. Before I knew what was happening, the guys threw me on the ground and climbed into the car, peeling out of the parking lot and down the street before their doors even shut. I couldn't even process it all as my boyfriend ran over to me and held me off the ground. I just started crying. The police officer was outside too, talking into his radio about what had happened and asked me if I was okay. I said I was, but I didn't know if I meant it or not. I still don't know. If they had just been a second too late, I would be in that car with them right now, going who knows where to have who knows what done to me. The Uber arrived not long after that, and after speaking briefly with the officer, we got in the car and went to the hotel. We got there safely, and once we were in the hotel, I stopped shaking. I couldn't sleep though, and even though I'm back home, hundreds of miles from the creeps, I can't help but be paranoid that they'll find me somehow, or somehow I'll run into them again. I don't like thinking about what could have happened to me, but I can't make my mind shut off. I can't make it go away. I guess what I learned from this, and what I can tell all of you, is always make sure that your phone is charged, that you have enough money, and that you don't go anywhere alone. Even if it's just for a moment, you could still be taken in an instant. This past December, I had taken a road trip down to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We had used my car and both my sister and husband's car to transport everything and all of us. We had rented a beach house for a little over a week. We had a pretty great time. I was in the middle of a difficult point in my life, and struggling with employment and being in between jobs, and having just started 2 new jobs fresh. I was a little low on funds and worried about making my car payments and the like. So I opted to head home 2 days early with my car so I could try and get more hours at work. My family expressed being nervous as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I consoled them that I had been okay to be up all night, and I would head straight home and only stop for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver, a tad impatient, so I tend to go until I absolutely had to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip and I knew that I would need breaks. So I made a point to stop at every rest stop to at least get out and stretch so I stayed awake and didn't get too sore. Going through West Virginia, I'm sure you guys know how secluded their rest stops and visitor centers are, especially when you're heading north from the south and going through the mountains. I stopped at a visitor center because they advertised having a fast food joint and I had to piss like a racehorse. This was sometime very late at night, maybe between 1 and 3 a.m. Side note, that sends shivers down my spine after what happens. I like to drive barefoot, so I pulled in, noticing the buildings with fast food were closed, so I drove around the lot and parked under a streetlight in front of the visitor center so I could use the restroom. Leaning out of my car door, I took my time putting my shoes on to walk inside, having looked around and not seen anything out of the ordinary. I checked my phone and grabbed my wallet before standing up to walk in, making sure my car horn beeped to signal my doors were locked. Walking towards the center, I saw a man in a white hoodie standing at the edge of the sidewalk leading into the center. I didn't think much of it, until I passed him and got an off vibe. I glanced over my shoulder and he was watching me walk in. For some reason, I glanced to my left as I turned back to face forward, and noted another man sitting at the benches that were on the other side of the tall, thin bushes. Instantly, I thought, nope, no way. I went in and I peed, and before I walked out of the bathroom, I called my roommate. As dumb as it was because he was a good 4 or 6 hours away, I just felt safer. I gave him a quick rundown of my situation, and I made him stay on the phone with me. I started to walk out, and I couldn't see the man at the front of the sidewalk anymore. I glanced to mine outright, and saw both men standing next to a bench. Facing forward, I saw a couple walking in to presumably use the restroom as well. I had an impulse to ask them to walk with me, but my paranoia kicked in because I knew something was wrong somewhere in my situation, and I didn't ask, thinking they might know the men. Walking briskly to my car, I explained to my roommate that the men were by the benches, daring the smallest of peeks over my shoulder again. I saw the man in the white hoodie walking towards me, and I told my roommate. Walking a few more paces forward, I looked back and I saw his pace had quickened. At this point, I told my roommate that he's following me to my car and I booked it. I thankfully had a key fob, got my key out and ready, and unlocked my car and practically threw myself in. Not daring to glance back, I threw my car in reverse and gunned it backwards before going back into drive, and I sped off. And I didn't even stop to put my seatbelt on until I was at the exit to leave the parking lot. I didn't look back once. I stopped at the next toll road and filed a report, and the workers called for state troopers to head over and check things out. I didn't stop shaking for hours, and I refused to get out of my car until I was home. I horrified myself at the thought of if those guys had paid attention and made their move more quickly, they could have incapacitated me in my car while I was facing the ground and putting my shoes on, and I would have had no way to stop them. The scariest night of my entire life was a close encounter with a later confirmed murderer when I was camping with my boyfriend in the mountains. It ended with us running for our lives down the mountain in the pitch black, clutching knives and a hammer for self-protection. It was the end of 2018, our first getaway together as a couple. We went to the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. We were naive. We thought it would be more romantic to camp out as far off the beaten track as possible. We walked really far into the wilderness and got to a spot where nobody passed us all afternoon. We were making s'mores over the campfire after it had just got dark. It was twilight. All of a sudden, my boyfriend saw a man approaching us slowly. He was creeping up on us. At first, we thought it was a park ranger, coming to tell us to put out our campfire. I began to hide the weed, thinking this was our biggest concern. My boyfriend called out to him, "Hey, can I help you?" We thought it was weird that he didn't have any kind of light on him. She didn't have any camping bag, nothing for camping. Why was he out here so far with no camping gear at night, with no light? He sped up after my boyfriend called out and came right at him. He had this strange look in his eyes. The look was absent, blank, and weird. He didn't answer my boyfriend. He just kept walking right at him. Red flags going off at this point. When my boyfriend realized that it wasn't a park ranger, he quickly put his hand in his pocket where he had a concealed knife. He made it clear that he had a weapon. It was only after my boyfriend did this that the guy acknowledged us. He said something weird. "Oh, I was just wondering if y'all were having a party." Remember, we were miles away from a single soul, and it was beginning to get dark when he began to approach us slowly without a flashlight. He had no camping gear with him, just a tiny drawstring bag on his back. After he asked what we were doing, we didn't give him any answers but asked what was going on. He didn't answer. He just looked past my boyfriend towards the site. It was windy, so we had put up a tarp to shield ourselves. This also meant that the guy approaching couldn't see how many people were at our site. He asked, "How many people you got with ya?" He began to circle our site to check us out. He asked again if we had any other people with us, and my boyfriend didn't answer. He carried on circling around our camp. Now bear in mind, we had set up our camp on this crazy steep hill. It was the only spot for miles that was possible to put a camp. However, he told us that he was going to set up camp nearby. He proceeded to walk off in that direction straight up the hill. We knew for a fact he couldn't put a campsite there because of the terrain. Remember, he had no light and no bag with camp gear. Nothing. We were silent. We listened to his footsteps on the leaves, as he walked up the hill in the direction completely off the path. He walked for about 30 seconds, and then his footsteps stopped completely. He was just still, silent. We knew he was still there, but we couldn't see him. It was dark. At this point, I was freaking out. I didn't want to seem like a baby in front of my boyfriend. We had to talk about whether we needed to leave. My boyfriend handed me a knife and said, if anything happens to me, I should run. At this point, I knew it wasn't just me freaking out unnecessarily. He said that we needed to get out of there and just to grab essential items. I was scared that he was about to shoot us dead. Later on, when I told my boyfriend this, he said no. This is the type of guy who would probably prefer to stab his victims to death. We began to walk, kind of run down the trail in the pitch black with our lights off for at least a mile. My boyfriend looked back to see him staring at one point. He ran behind me to protect me. This experience stuck with me. I still can't think of a rational or non-menacing reason why that guy was out there that night. I've tried. Now this was the end of 2018, but my boyfriend, now husband, and I were remembering it last night. I decided to type in Google if there had been any murders in the same place around the same time. And there was. A few months after our incident on the same trail, an unhinged man with crazy eyes approached some hikers at twilight as it was getting dark. He behaved in a deranged and aggressive manner, before stabbing a man to death with a 17-inch knife. A woman he was with ran for her life down the trail. Finally, she raised her hands in surrender, and he began to stab her. Somehow, she managed to get away. The killer carried on wandering the trail, and shouted out to other campers to give him a flashlight. They didn't, thank goodness. All of these details are the same as the guy who approached us. Same age, same deranged eyes, same lack of flashlight, same time to approach us, same look, same place. The more articles I read, the more I realize this psychopath had been roaming the trails harassing hikers for a while. A few different people had reported him, not just us. Apparently this erratic and violent psychopath was well known to law enforcement along the Appalachian Trail. His name is James Sovereign Jordan. We got lucky. It could have been us. This happened to me when I was 17, around the time when most of my friends were getting their driver's license. We all had that rush for cars back then, so it was quite common for us to skip school and go for a ride out of town. The city where I live is surrounded by forests and 2 mountains, so we basically had a lot of places to go and chill. One day, my friend was very excited to show us a place that he found about online, possibly here on Reddit, for which people said was quite odd. We looked it up and apparently it had a reputation for being a paranormal site. Being the typical group of teens, we collectively agreed to check it out as soon as we could, including me, who more or less believes in spiritual stuff. Going up the mountain, we were listening to the radio until we lost the station to static, which for obvious reasons is what the radio does when you go deep into the woods. This entire experience was happening during a summer night, so we were feeling pretty careless and as excited as a person can be. Having no music to listen to, we started talking and discussing our expectations for this place, with most of us having no expectations at all. Our conversation was suddenly interrupted by the loud static coming from the radio that we had turned off just a few minutes ago. We were all a bit startled, but still, nothing out of the ordinary. It happened again a few minutes later. We all looked at the radio. It was still off. We quickly dismissed this as something that radios do for some reason, and again, didn't pay much attention. The third time that it happened, the driver hit the brakes and stopped the car. He turned to us and yelled, "What the hell, did you hear that? What was that?" Claiming that he heard a voice this time. None of us heard anything except static. The driver said that he had had enough, and he switched the engine off, so there is no possible way for anything, including the radio, to be working. We sat like that for a while in pitch black, for there were no city lights around us, and the forest had covered all other light sources, like the stars and so on. The light indicating the radio turned on, and soon after, the static came. I could tell that we were all feeling a bit anxious by then. Through the static came a female voice singing, and it was very silent. For a second, it got louder, then fell back to silent again, and then it vanished. But even weirder, the static vanished too. Once we switched the car back on and turned the headlights on too, we observed what seemed to be smudges of fingers across the frickin' windshield. We didn't turn the car around immediately, but I could tell that we all just wanted to leave. We stopped further up on the hill, took some pictures of the Milky Way, and then went home afterward. Ever since, we speculate about what the hell happened to the radio in the windshield that night. My friends went 2 more times without me to the same place, recording the same stuff, including feeling a small push once the car was off. What do you guys think? I believe there are many logical explanations, but considering the fact that I'm somewhat of a person who believes in such stuff, and had an adrenaline rush that night, it's hard for me to grasp something rational. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time that we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We had only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were frontiersmen. We would build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea is that we would walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from, and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this could be dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we would see each other occasionally. One summer in the mid-90s, it worked out so that we both were in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and then walk home. The day came. We started out in the early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot that we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought that this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we would take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and we sat on the edge, smoking a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick, forested area, trees on every side of the train track so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought hammocks to sleep in, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure that some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their backyard. We walked maybe 100 feet or so into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw that it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on the top of the place, all weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, and no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot that we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. And besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears, and then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the hell out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around. But I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I remember this day like it was yesterday. The dialogue isn't word for word, but the idea of it is 100% accurate. As a side note, it was one day after 8 people were shot less than 2 hours away. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area of about 3/4 of a mile. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years and I had been going with him since I was 5. Up until I was 12, the legal age to hunt with a rifle, I had just been tagging along. This particular morning, we walked to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m., so it was still dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to our other 2 stands over the ridge, maybe another 500 or 600 yards away. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving my direction. I figured they had forgot something from the truck or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. "We're sitting in my stand. Frank is about to head to the other one," he says. Obviously, the flashlight is someone else. This isn't super uncommon and really isn't a big deal. Those woods get crowded sometimes and there is a spot to park in that general direction. I turn on my light so the other hunter can see that there is someone there. He stops. I see the light turn and go in a different direction. No big deal. I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up, the sun is up and it's around 8 a.m. I sit there for a bit, radio my dad to see if he has heard or seen anything move. Nothing yet. A couple gunshots off in the distance is all. I get up and I go for a slow little walk to get my blood moving a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make a sound. I come back to my stand, sit down and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. I finally look out to my left, where I had seen the flashlight before, and I see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radio my dad and Frank to see if either one of them were moving around. Dad says no. I hear nothing from Frank. I grab the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it's Frank. It's definitely not. This guy is looking at me through his scope, rifle aimed directly at me. This is a huge no-no. Massive rule we all learn in hunter's education. Never point your rifle at something you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it though. It's few and far between, but it happens. This is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought is, what a freaking dickbag. Thing is, even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now I'm starting to panic, thinking I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grab my rifle, get up, staying behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on this kind of little knoll on the side of a much larger hill. I radio my dad and tell him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that and I had to keep looking. But every time I looked at the guy, he was still aiming in my direction, but was also standing in a different spot. Like I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me. "How you doing, bud?" Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought he just wasn't taking me seriously. "He's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is." Dad told me to just keep hidden and he'll figure it out. That he'll be coming up near me in a minute or two. And that's when I hear the shot. I lost my shit trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where the hell is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What is going on? I sit there for maybe 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours. Alright, come on out and head towards my stand. I peek up over the little knoll I was behind and see my dad waving from along the ridge the random guy had been on. I make the trek on over to him to see what had happened. It turns out that Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing that he was there. He had knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning, and had no idea anything was even going on. The shot I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy walked off away from us towards the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, the rest of the week went on with no incidents. When my cousin and I were younger, we spent a great deal of time together. We would get into all sorts of mischief, as boys do. I was staying over at my aunt and uncle's visiting my cousin one weekend when we came across something that, at the time, we didn't think to bring up to anyone older and smarter than we were. We live in South Carolina for what it's worth, and we are around the ages of 12 and 8, me being the older of the two. The area around my aunt and uncle's house had some small, densely wooded areas, but overall, the area isn't anything I would consider rural. We decided to explore an area of woods across from my aunt and uncle's house, a spot that we hadn't really explored much of. Not too far from the road, we came across an old house. It wasn't in bad shape, and even had a little garden with a well enough tended flower bed. Our first thought was, reasonably enough, that we would run into someone's yard. Passing through, we noticed one of the windows to the home was broken, so we decided to peek in. There wasn't much of anything in the house. It was devoid of furniture or anything else that would imply that someone actually lived there. Naturally, we tried the doors to see if we could get in. No luck. We then heard a car pulling up to the house from the opposite side of us. My cousin and I darted for the tree line and followed some power lines into the nearby woods. A large section of the woods here had been cleared out to allow for the power lines to be where they were. So, picture a clearing of around 100 or so feet surrounded by woods on either side. After following the power lines for quite a bit, we got hit by the unmistakable smell of something dead. We kept on and noticed a wooden tower standing off the side through the woods a bit. We excitedly hurried to investigate it. On the way, we found a dead dog. That would explain the smell, and it wasn't too unusual. And then we found another and another. Surrounding the entire stand were the corpses of dead dogs. It had to be over 30 carcasses. They were all in varying states of decay. Some seemed only a few days old. Some were nothing but bones. We were alarmed but still dumb kids and wanted to climb to the top, so we did. At the top, we found even more dog carcasses. So, process this. Not only were there bodies of dead dogs surrounding this tower stand, someone had put forth the effort to drag them some 30 feet up a slim ladder to the top. Unsettled, we made our way back to my aunt and uncle's after that. We never mentioned it to anyone, or at least I never did. Thinking back on it 15 years later, we definitely should have said something. I've tried looking up similar things in the area, but I haven't had any luck. We never went back there after finding that horrible scene. I also wouldn't conclude that the house we found or the person that showed up there are in any way related to the tower stand. That's just how our story began. I went to summer camp in a rural part of New Jersey back in the mid-1990s. The camp was situated on a long, narrow, man-made lake. One end of the lake was reserved for swimming, which we would do as a group activity every other day or so. The swimming area had one long dock stretching straight out into the water, and 2 square floating docks further out. One of the 2 floating docks was a bit far away, and although I had spent a few summers at this camp at the time of the incident, I had never seen anyone else using the second dock. One day, our group of about a dozen 11-year-olds got the bright idea that we were going to swim out to the faraway dock. I would consider this to be a moderate challenge for a casual swimmer. When we reached the dock, I noticed a strange-looking spider on the ladder that you had to use to climb up. It was quite large in terms of overall footprint, probably around 2 inches from end to end, with long, skinny legs. Spiders, of course, are normal critters to encounter in nature, but this one stood out to me because of its unusual appearance. After the long swim, we took a few minutes to lie on the dock and rest in the sun. It was relaxing and we were all having a good time. We started messing around and decided to play one of our regular games where we would all shuffle towards the corner of the dock, causing it to sink. As the corner of the dock started to sink and fill with water, suddenly hundreds of giant spiders came frantically pouring out from between the boards, swarming over and around the feet of those of us who were still standing on dry ground. This dock was theirs apparently. We all immediately began to scream and jump into the water trying to get away, but the spiders were in the water too, and stuck to us as we swam. I vividly remember the feeling of them clinging to my wet hair, fleshy bodies and long squirming legs, hopelessly intertwined with my own strands. Adrenaline propelled us back into the main part of the swimming area, and by the time we got there, thankfully, we were spider-free. But this is a childhood trauma that lingers with me. I hadn't really been afraid of spiders before, but I would say that this was a major turning point. The thought of us lying on the dock in the sun, completely oblivious to the horror that was lurking just inches beneath us, it creeps me out to this day. I posted this as a comment in a different thread, and it made me think of this. Brought back the memory of this awful camping experience, and also why we don't camp outside of well-populated campgrounds anymore. The woods are safe. It's the people that you have to worry about. The one instance that I will never forget though was a man that just showed up at our group camping site, also miles away from any actual campground, and watched us behind different trees from a distance. A few of us said hello, but he wouldn't answer. Yet when he saw the kids, he tried to talk to them repeatedly. We were a big group of adults, but since we had children with us, some of the guys finally went over and confronted him. He claimed not to be watching us, and he walked away. Then later that night, he pulled up in a beat-up RV and parked, blacking us in, right next to our makeshift group site. The RV itself was bizarre and creepy. He had children's underwear in the dash, toys and junk piled up, and so on. It was getting dark and we were all around the fire when he suddenly walks up and stands in our little circle. He made a comment right off the bat that all the little ones went to bed already, which freaked me out immediately. The guys asked him to leave semi-nicely, not knowing what his deal was. About a half hour later, I could see him standing off behind a tree smoking. I couldn't see him, but I saw the end of his cigarette. He just watched and chain-smoked. It was unnerving. In the middle of nowhere, being watched by a man who seemed so focused on our kids. Not to mention that, out of the 3 other families we were with, my family of 4 was the only one in a tent, which didn't feel as safe as an RV or camper within there. I went to bed when our 2 kids did, so they weren't alone. Our tent was on the further side of the site, away from the fire. Shortly after the kids fell asleep, I heard crunching in the woods around the tent and called my husband's name, thinking he was stumbling in the dark looking for our tent door. When he didn't answer, I unzipped the door and shined the light around, right across the feet of the creepy guy. I instantly jumped up and started yelling. All the guys came running from the fire. The creepy guy just stood there and stared at us, didn't explain himself. Not that he would have a good reason, and then he turned and walked away. I was beyond done. We packed up our stuff and crammed it in the car, pleading with our friends to leave, but they wouldn't. I was the only adult there that hadn't been drinking, so no one could drive home. I drove home so awake and on high alert all the way. Our friends that stayed did have guns, and they all had secured campers and RVs to sleep in. They came home the next night and had even more bizarre encounters with the creep. Each of us did contact the authorities, by the way. This did not happen to me, but I live in the area where it took place. As far as I know, this is not a made-up story. My friend and I were discussing these scary things that we've seen in the woods, and he told me a story that happened to his friend. This guy was with 5 of his friends who were spending a few days in a cabin hunting and trapping. They were not drunk, but they had a few beers to unwind one night. So, one of them goes out to the outhouse to go to the bathroom, and he swears that off in the woods, he hears the faint sound of a drum beating. He finishes in the outhouse and goes into the cabin to tell his friends to come out and check out the sound. They all grab their rifles and walk out of the ridge their cabin was on, and down the hollow behind it and back up the other side. It was a pretty rocky area, so the sound traveled far, and they could tell that just over the hill was where the sound was coming from. 5 of them spread out about 50 feet apart and walked up to the top. They couldn't see down or over because of all the laurel bushes around them. So, the 5 of them waited, and one went to sneak down to see what it was. When he got there, he stood and watched for about 30 seconds to a minute, before he turned around and went to his friends as fast as he could, telling them he saw evil, and they had to get the hell out of there right then. All he would tell them is that he saw a bunch of naked men and women dancing around in a circle chanting something in a foreign language. He never told them about everything he saw. The guy who told my friend this story was one of the guys who hung back, and he didn't see what happened. Whatever it was, I'm glad we didn't stay there much longer. I went to college in Moorhead, Kentucky, and this was back in 2017, I think. There are these old mining caves called the Mushroom Mines, and they aren't in use anymore, but it was a hotspot for spooks and exploring. People always say crazy stuff goes down there, like rituals and so on, but I only believe the occasional drug deal or something. Someone said the police found a goat cut in half down the center of its face, but I never saw evidence of that, so I don't believe it even today. Me, my friend Teddy, and my boyfriend at the time decided to go to the caves around 2 or 3 p.m. one afternoon after class. I can't remember who, but I think we had 1 or 2 other friends with us. Maybe Teddy's friend, because I honestly can't remember. When we got there, there was another car parked outside of the caves, and it seemed like it didn't belong to anyone crazy. It was a lime green little thing, clean as what we could see with the windows rolled down, maybe because it was hot as hell outside at the time. No one was around that we could see though. That wasn't really weird because there were a lot of hiking trails next to the cave, and no one was in the mouth of the cave, so we assumed they must be hiking. We were exploring the mouth of the cave, and only going maybe 10 to 20 feet deep. This was because if you've ever been to a mine or deep cave before that isn't in use, you know it's pitch freaking black and it's cold. We did have flashlights, but we still weren't trying to go a mile in or anything. All of a sudden, Teddy just asked us, "Did you guys see that?" This immediately sent chills down my spine, and I think he was just trying to scare us. My boyfriend goes to where he's standing and asks what he saw. As Teddy is explaining that he thinks he saw a small light come on down the cave, way deeper down. A small light clicks on way further than we are down the cave, as if reacting to his acknowledgement. It was a light from a flashlight. It clicks back off and we take a second, and we get the hell out of there. So guys, I don't know what to think of this all. They didn't have their light on when we first showed up, so they were what? Just hanging out there in the dark? They didn't say hi to us or speak at all, and it's weird that it seems like they almost tried to get one of our attention, instead of again just calling out and greeting us all. They also had no idea we were coming, or that anyone would be coming. We had all skipped our afternoon classes, so most students wouldn't even be there until 5 or 6 to explore. Please tell me what you all think. I haven't gone back since. Obviously, I don't think it was a monster or a ghost, but if anything, people freak me out more. Especially ones who hang out in old mines alone with no light. My husband and I love to go driving. We prefer road trips. But on the weekends or nights, when we have nothing better to do, we go cruising and just drive around. We prefer smooth and not busy roads. On this particular night, we were bored and we decided to go cruising. We went up north to a small town about a half hour from the city where the roads are curvy and smooth. This town is close to the mountains, and if you follow this particular main street all the way up north, it starts driving up to a mountain. It's about 9 p.m., and there are very few cars on the roads already, since it's a small little cute town. But we keep going north away from the houses and stores and eventually to where the roads start curving uphill. We drive up for about 15 minutes more, and it's pitch black when we see some blinking lights. As we get closer, we see that a truck is on the side of the road facing us. I'm getting the chills thinking about being all the way up here in the middle of nowhere and a stranded truck on the side of the road. As he slowly approaches closer, I tell my husband it's probably for the best to turn back and that I had a bad feeling. But at this point, we were pretty much at the truck. As he pulls up next to the truck, a young blonde guy, maybe in his late 20s, comes around and gets next to our window. I get such a bad vibe by this, and I tell my husband not to put the window down. I think he also is getting a weird feeling because he actually listens. He kind of just loudly asks what's wrong, and the guy just says something's wrong with his truck and that he might need a hand. His phone is dead. My husband asked what happened, but the guy just insists on showing him to come and take a look. He says it very friendly and even calls him bro and says that he's so glad that we pulled up. My husband says, "You know what, I won't be much help. I know nothing about cars, but let me call for help." He knows a lot about cars, but he was lying. The guy is insisting, and he gets visibly upset. I'm looking back at the truck, and I thought I caught movement inside of it. I told my husband that I think we should go, now. He probably saw the look of fear in my face because he put the car in reverse. But as he did, the guy that is now behind our car, acting stressed out, rubbing his face and kind of pacing. So, my husband decides to go forward instead then. We drive up for maybe 2 minutes, trying to find a place to turn around since the road is so narrow. The road turns to dirt road and there's a little more space on the side, so he is able to turn the car around. I am dreading going back that way now, and our phones have no signal at all. In my mind, I know that this all could really be someone with car problems. Maybe a friend is in the truck too. He never said that he was alone. I just can't help the bad feeling in my gut. We soon reach the area where the truck had been, but there's no truck at all. We drive down maybe another 5 minutes, but no trace of the truck, and we are sure that we had passed the place where it had been. Like I said, we didn't drive up too far to begin with. I am both relieved and terrified that the truck was no longer there. If it really had broken down, how did they get it to work again in such a short time? Calming myself down, I'm telling my husband, hey, maybe they really did get it to work. Maybe it turned on all of a sudden and they were able to drive off. Suspicious, but not impossible. As we keep driving through and the roads are straightening out, we notice far off the truck with all the lights off and parked to the side again, and we notice movement in the bed of the truck. I say out loud, why did they turn off all the lights? I think they think that we are still too far away to see them. But we see two figures get on the other side of the truck and crouch down as if hiding. We get closer and my husband floors it. As we drive past, two men get up, One of them, the guy we had spoken to, and someone else. We get closer, and my husband floors it. As we drive past, two men get up. One of them, the guy that we had spoken to, and someone else, with a very surprised look in their faces. One of them runs behind us for a bit, and we see them get tinier in the back. I keep looking back terrified, but it's dark back there now when all of a sudden, I see the headlights turn on in the truck and start driving in our direction very fast. My husband keeps going fast and eventually, we lose the headlights. I keep looking back the rest of the way, so scared that they're somehow still following us. Maybe they turned off their lights again and we can't see them. Anyway, after driving for a very long time back to the city, we convince ourselves that no one is following us. We do call the non-emergency line and give a description of what we saw. No, we didn't get the plates in the truck. It was all so fast and in all the fear, I didn't think to get them. We just give a description of the guy that we saw, the type of truck it was, and so on. But there's really nothing that could be done. I realized all of this could be rationalized, but in the moment, we were filled with terror, being out there in the middle of nowhere and all the possibilities. They could have been armed. They could have put their truck sideways and left us with nowhere to go. They could have put something on the road to rip up our tires. And even though it could all have some explanation, there are still so many questions. Why couldn't he tell us what was wrong? How did the truck work again so fast? Why did they turn off all their lights? Why did they hide? It's been about a year and it's just a creepy experience now. We still go cruising, but usually we just stick to a little more civilized areas, at least for nighttime cruises. I used to ride a motorcycle as a sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I used to work on hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypically grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening into the night, finished cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m., and walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and make the journey home. I can still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch black silence of the countryside after the hot and seemingly never-ending nights of serving drinks to dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always sort of intensely relaxing. Now that being an adult meant not being scared of the dark, or being outside on a motorcycle in the middle of nearly nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local town took me a few minutes before I left to follow the dark country roads home. At this point, I rode a Honda 125cc, around 11 horsepower. Basic and old but clean, and it did the job. Regardless of its quirks, such as a dim headlight, which would dim and flicker even more when coming to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads with fields and woods surrounding me, very much alone for 20 minutes. And then I saw a brief blast of bright blue headlights in my mirrors coming from behind. Moments later, dazzling headlights arrived behind me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover pulls out to overtake me, blasting past barely inches away from me. I respond with a long blast on my horn. Big mistake. The Range Rover pulls in front of me and slams on the anchors, in what seemed like an attempt to have me lose control under sudden braking, or rear-end the Range Rover. Bikes can, even when they're old and rely on drum brakes, stop pretty quickly. So, I didn't rear-end the maniac in front. I came to a controlled stop. I see the door of the Range Rover crack open, and a figure begin to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda's power, pulling an overtake. However, in those moments, this anger-crazed maniac had shut his door and stepped on the accelerator, causing us to be level and accelerating together when I reached his car. And then he decided to run me off the road, pulling to the right, wedging me further over towards the ditch at the side of the road. This is where I ended up, struggling to control the bike on the wet, dew-heavy grass around the side of the road, trying to stop the 140-kilogram motorcycle dropping into the ditch. I struggled to regain balance, but managed to pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed the guy had got back out of the Range Rover and walked around to the back, opened it up, and was reaching inside. I had turned the bike to face the other side of the road, ready to turn either way and make an escape from the escalating situation. Just as I looked to turn, I took one more look over at him to see him pulling a large, long object out of the back of the Range. I just went for it, taking another glance over my shoulder. After 200 meters to see, he had begun to continue driving up the road away from where I had run off the road. I slowed down to see what he would do next after driving away from me. He reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, the lights reflecting on the road. It was freaking eerie. My heart was beating so fast, yet it felt like time had stopped. I just carried on in the opposite direction to find an alternate route home in the pitch black. Just before doing this, I checked my phone for signal to see that I had no reception at all. I was driving on the back roads on the edge of the city limits. It was dark, no lighting at all. A few rest stops here and there. I was meeting a woman off of Craigslist, already feeling a bit nervous. I was going pretty fast, no other cars in sight. Out of nowhere, I see a guy running across the road. He was already almost right in front of my car. It looked like he was getting chased by another guy who I didn't see until I swerved to avoid the first one while braking hard. My car went kind of sideways and hit the second guy pretty fierce, not at full speed. I heard a loud thud, but didn't actually see him get hit. My car ended up on the side of the road. The first guy seemed to have kept running out of sight. He wasn't there when I got out. This was a big red flag. But I had just hit someone, and I was worried that I'd off them. I was all shaky, and I had that sinking feeling in my stomach. I ran towards the guy who was on the floor, breathing heavily. Thank goodness he was alive. I asked him if he was okay. He didn't respond. He just kept breathing really hard. And then I took out my phone to call 911. As I was typing in the number, that's when I just heard him say, "No, don't call anyone. Don't call the cops." He said it pretty alarmed. So I just looked over at him with my phone in hand to flash on. I asked him if he could stand. He got up slowly with a slight limp. With my light shining on him, I could see that his clothes were all tattered, and he was wearing like 2 layers of clothing with a jacket. Now torn at the arms, he had blood on his arms, I guess from where he landed on the ground. He said, "I'm fine. Do you have any cigarettes?" I said, "Yeah, let me go get them." I had a pack in my glove box since forever. I was an occasional smoker and only smoked with my coworker. Not in a while though. We walked over to my car, and I got these cigarettes and I handed them to him. And then I put my phone to charge. The car was still on. As I did, he asked for a lighter. I said, "Yeah, hold on, let me look for it." While lighting his cigarette, that's when I asked him, "Who was the other guy?" He said, "Oh, someone who stole my backpack from me while I was sleeping." Oh, okay, he was definitely homeless then. I felt so bad. I started pulling out my wallet. I wanted to give him all the money in my wallet out of guilt. He looked fine now, albeit the bloody scraped arms, and his breathing had gotten normal. while pulling out my wallet and asking, "You sure you don't want me to call an ambulance?" And that's when I felt the sharpest pain rock my face. I saw all blurry for a couple of seconds. I started stumbling. My body felt like I was about to fall over. Dizzy, when I came to, I saw my car pulling away and driving off. He punched me and took off, and left me with a pretty bad headache. I stood there in shock for what seemed like an eternity. I reached for my phone out of instinct, and then I remembered that I had left it charging. Crap. I reached under my jacket to check if my gun was still on me. I felt relieved when I felt the cold metal of my Sig Sauer. Okay, good. At least I ain't out here defenseless. I kept walking down the road endlessly, hoping to find someone. I'm pissed off and scared. A few good miles later, I see some lights. As I get closer, I see it's one of those public restrooms. With nothing else in sight. Great, there might be a payphone. And now what do I see next? I couldn't believe my eyes. There's a car that looks just like mine parked right out front. I take a peek. The guy that took my car is asleep. It looks like he cleaned his arms off. No jacket. That moron. He could have kept driving, but I'm glad he didn't. I take out my gun and I try to open the door. It's locked. I try all of the doors. Locked. I didn't want to wake him up by banging on the car because I was afraid that he was going to drive off. I looked all over the ground. Nothing to break the window, so I holster my gun, take off my jacket, and wrap it around my hand. I smash through it, glass spilling everywhere. The guy jerks awake and starts fumbling around. All the while, I drop the jacket and rapidly unholster my gun again. I'm pointing my gun right at his head, and he says, "Please don't shoot me." Instead of saying sorry, he says that stuff. I tell him to get out and walk towards the wall with his back turned. So I backed up and he complied. I tell him not to move, and then ask him where my keys are. After I got my keys from him, I drove off, with glass all over the inside of my car. I never called the cops because I had hit him earlier, and then because I pulled my gun on him. I was scared and worried about the legality of it. Also, I had bought it from an arms list, but the seller never signed the bill of sale, only I did. So I was sketched about that as well. The last thing I need is them checking my gun after he tells them about it, and finding out the guy who sold me it reported it as stolen. I probably would have been fine calling them, but I was tripping. I never met the Craigslist chick. I went home. I used to live in a part of Memphis, Tennessee that was a little shaky. I was right on the edge of what someone would call the ghetto. But also, there was a nearby area that was pretty secluded and desolate, as I lived on the outskirts of the city. Kind of near the industrial part near Raleigh for anyone familiar. Anyway, I was an 8-year-old boy when this happened, and my sister was 5 years my senior. The two of us went for walks on occasion. This time, we went to the back of the housing division and further than we had gone before. This area was pretty dirty and desolate for such a city. Just train tracks and a nearby industrial facility. Lots of dried tan grass coming through spots in the railroad gravel. Lots of dusty crap people dumped illegally around the tracks. There used to be a pack of stray dogs that walked around my neighborhood. But other than that, no people or cars would really ever be seen out there. Not that far behind my neighborhood anyway. We were just walking along the tracks, talking, throwing rocks, when I saw some strange movement just beyond the tree line of this small wooded area about 40 feet ahead and on the left a bit. I told my sister to look as we walked a bit closer. We made it to about 10 to 15 feet away from the wooded area, when we realized the movement was in fact a mime of all things. In the middle of nowhere seemingly, hidden amongst the trees and thick dead vines that adorn the edge of the wooded area. Painted face, black striped shirt with black pants. He had the exaggerated expressions of a mime too. His eyes got really wide and he seemed to start performing for us at the moment. He was kind of doing it in a way too, I guess, to attract us. Maybe entice us into the wooded area where he stood, or lurked for that matter. I honestly couldn't tell you much about him, as we ran away quickly. I do, however, remember that it was very hot outside that day, and his makeup was all pretty dingy and gross, as were his clothes. I know this sounds pretty unbelievable, but I assure you that it happened. Otherwise, it would be posted somewhere else. I sometimes wonder who that mime was. I'm sure he wasn't there to do anybody any harm, but who knows what would have happened if we would have gone into that thicket. And why there? He was just simply insane, I think. His mind was gone. Which is far more creepy than any kidnapping stranger I have read about. This happened 2 summers ago, while I was house sitting out in California for an older couple that I had met at a conference for work. It had seemed like a dream scenario. The couple wanted a vacation in Hawaii for 2 weeks, but didn't want to board their cats, and I had been chatting with them about wanting to visit California again, where they happened to live, because I had loved it the first time that I went, and we figured that we could mutually benefit if I came out and I house sat for them. So, I flew out there, and they showed me around for a few days, taught me how to care for the cats, and there was 2 of them. One that was extremely shy and that I barely saw, which is important later. And their plants. They gave me access to their house and cars, and these people were very generous. And before I knew it, I dropped them off at the airport and I was on my own. At first, it really was the dream vacation. I was staying in Oakland and making forays into San Fran, Sonoma, Monterey. In the mornings, I could just walk out the front door and shortly be hiking the pass surrounding nearby Mount Diablo, and I was just ultra content with the world. I was so enamored by the area that I had actually started looking into taking some steps to relocate there even. But then one day, about halfway through my final week there, when I got back to the house, I felt really odd. Almost like I shouldn't go inside. But I shook it off and I went inside anyway. It was getting late and I needed to put out dinner for the cats. Once I was inside, I forced myself to ignore how off I felt, and I made some food for myself and went to bed, and was shocked to find the shy cat hiding under my bed and crying. This was the first time that I had even seen her up close. The entire time that I had been there up to that point, she never left the host bedroom until she didn't realize that I was around. Again, I ignored the weird feeling and just assumed that she had decided I was okay and went to bed. I did start locking my bedroom door at night though. I also remember that about halfway through that night, I thought I heard someone walking around in the gravel outside of my window. But after listening for a bit, I didn't hear anything else and I went back to sleep. The day after in the morning, I still felt a little odd, but I kept up with my plans for the day. I drove out to a little music festival in Sonoma and went clothes shopping, and overall I had a great day. When I got back to the house though, I found the front door locked in a way that I hadn't left it. Basically, my host never locked the deadbolt, only the lower second lock, and that's the only lock that my key worked on, so I never messed with the deadbolt. But it was definitely locked. So I had to call my host and find the hide key, which, to their credit safety-wise, was buried like a whole foot underneath the bush outside, and had definitely not been unearthed for a long time. So I used that, went inside, and I kept the key with me just in case it happened again. And it did, but with a different door. This time, I had stepped out into the garage to get a drink, and when I turned around to go back into the house, the door was shut and locked. I could use my normal key on that door, but I was still pretty bewildered. My own cats are whack, so I think in my mind I was trying to come up with a way the cats could be locking me out of the house, but I was coming up empty. I decided I must have been misunderstanding how the locks worked, and I just wrote it off and started checking and triple checking locks when I went out of the house or out into the garage. That night when I went to bed, the really awful feeling of unease was still there, and so was the shy cat, who was clearly unhappy to see me, but also wouldn't leave my room. But again, I just locked my bedroom door and I went to sleep. The next morning, I felt awful. Nausea, body aches. I had no desire to leave the house, so I decided to stay in and watch Netflix for the day. This vacation stay was like a full 2 weeks, so I didn't feel like I was in any hurry to get all my touristy things in anyways. But as the day went on, I started to feel that feeling of wrongness again, and it morphed into the feeling of being incredibly watched. Around mid-afternoon, I got to the point that I was so uneasy that, even feeling awful, I decided to get out of the house for a bit to shake it off. I was getting a bit low on food, so I went to the grocery store and bought a couple food items that I didn't think would hurt my stomach. And as I started to leave the checkout, the cashier said the generic, "Have a great evening," and I just instantly started crying, shocking myself and the poor cashier, because I just had this intrusive thought that said, "You might be the last person to ever say that to me." When I got to my car, I was still crying and my entire body was telling me not to drive back to the house. I couldn't not though, because I didn't want to neglect the cat, so I drove back, parked in the driveway, and I convinced myself after about half an hour to just go and open the front door. Once I did that, I thought I would just get over with it and be able to go in and at least feed the cats, and then maybe I would go get a hotel room after. But my body physically would not let me inside. It was like I was stuck in the entryway. And then I made a deal with myself. I would yell into the house saying that I'd already called the police and that they were on their way. In panic logic, I figured that would make anyone in the house leave. So I faced the inside of the house, looking down the hallway towards the bedrooms. And I did just that. The second I had finished saying, "They're almost here, so if you want to avoid being arrested, you need to leave now," the light in my host's room turned on, and I heard some banging. I immediately hightailed it back to the car, called the police for real, and proceeded to have a mental breakdown while talking to the dispatcher. Once they got there, they checked the house and didn't find anyone, but the double doors in my host's bedroom were left wide open. I'm so glad the cats didn't get out. And there was a pile of food wrappers in the corner behind the blinds, so they said it looked like someone had been there. What makes it so scary to me is that nothing was taken, and that based on the shape of the house, that would have been the perfect vantage point to see me in the living room as I stayed home sick. And to explain this, the house was in an L shape, and from the windows into the garden that were in my host's bedroom, you could see into the living room windows. Also, the minute the police were gone, they said they couldn't prove anyone was there. There were no signs of forced entry, and we couldn't get a hold of my host immediately to verify if anything had been taken. Once they did get back, they verified that nothing had been taken, so they said they would patrol a bit but nothing else. The shy cat was right back in my host's bedroom, and I didn't see her again until I left to go back home. So basically, I think the intruder had been there at least 2 days, forcing her to choose between two strangers, and leading her to choose the one that was at least a little less strange, me. It messed me up pretty bad, especially because they didn't catch the person, and didn't seem to have any desire to lock, and I still had to stay in that house for the next 3 days. Nothing else odd happened, and I didn't feel anything off the rest of the time that I was there, but the damage was done. I've never felt completely safe in a home without doing a complete search before bed since. But I am extremely glad that my gut spoke up. I guess I would rather have some residual anxiety than be dead. So, whoever was in my host's house watching me, let's please never meet. When I was in 7th grade, my parents decided to take a 3-week-long summer trip to Europe. Most of the vacation was amazing. After all, I was a child in a different continent, and some people never get the chance to travel ever. But while I was in France, some things went down that I've thought about for years, and it still gives me chills. We were staying at a pretty nice hotel. I don't remember much except sharing a room with my little sister, and my parents sharing the other. But one night my parents went out to eat and said that I should take my sister into the hotel's indoor kids area for an hour, and then go back to the room. And so I did that. While at the play area, I watched my sister, obviously. Other people were there, mostly adults, all of whom I assumed were watching their children. But at one point, one of the aforementioned adults started talking to me. A brown-haired man, who simply looked like your average Joe, and didn't seem menacing at all. I just thought that he was trying to make conversation with this weird girl sitting alone at the kids' play area, so I talked with him. Basic stuff at first, how I liked traveling and where I came from. And then it got a little more personal. How old I was, where were my parents, was another sibling with me. Whenever he asked these questions, he would take out his phone and slightly point it at me. But being a dumb middle schooler, I didn't stop talking or leave. We had been talking for around 20 minutes and I noticed that it had been around an hour, so I said bye to him and I went to get my sister. I get her and I leave the area. But out of the corner of my eye, I see him pull out his phone and point dead straight at me. Even at 12, I could realize something was out of whack, so I booked it as fast as I could back to the hotel room. When my parents got back, I didn't tell them of the incident because I didn't want to hear a lecture on stranger danger. Besides, I thought I had seen the last of Mr. Creeper. But I was not that lucky. A different time when I took my sister to the play area, I saw the same man. I wasn't too worried, there were other adults around, so it's not like he could kidnap me right then. I still wanted to avoid conversation though. He started talking to me again, addressing me by my name, which somehow made the whole situation even more uncomfortable. I talked with him though, until he asked me what my room number was. I said that my parents said I shouldn't tell other people my room number, which was true, but I mainly just didn't want this weirdo to get my room number. He said that a rule like that only applied to strangers, and that me and him were not strangers. While he said this, he was touching my shoulder, which made me want to scream. It's funny he said that we weren't strangers because I then realized that I was the one giving all the personal information. I don't even think he told me where he came from. He said his name was Paul, but that name was so generic that he could have been lying, which he probably was. Those thoughts triggered me to say that I had to go. I was late to see my parents. I grabbed my little sister and I ran to the hotel's front desk, scared that if I went to my room, the man would follow me. I told the people at the desk the description of the man and where he was. They told me to go to my room and that they would take care of it. I went back to my room where my parents were waiting and I told them all about it. We left on a train a day early. I wasn't alone for the rest of the trip. So, a few years ago, my boyfriend's dad's family decided to get together and all chip in to rent a condo in Ontario. There is a big extended family over there that his dad never saw, because he only really got along with one of his 3 sisters. My boyfriend's mom had talked him into going though, and they let me tag along because I had been around long enough that they liked me and they trusted me. I can't remember where everyone else had gone. I think it was to the beach for like the 3rd time that day. It was just my boyfriend and I at the condo because we were kind of sick of the beach and just wanted to do nothing in the shade for a while. We were sitting outside, looking over the water and just kind of talking about life. I had just finished reading the Harry Potter series, so we were kind of talking about that, when this woman comes out of the brush beside the condo. Just for an idea, this condo was about an acre of land, maybe. and it was kind of out in the middle of nowhere. The front of the condo was probably 70 feet from a dirt road no one traveled down really, and there are some dense trees and brush and whatnot that surrounded 3 sides of it. This woman comes out of the wooded area, and I immediately knew something wasn't right. You see, she was limping and she only had on 1 sandal, and frankly, she looked like crap. She was pale and her face was gaunt. She was really, really pretty, but kind of looked exhausted. The thing that immediately caught my attention was her baby, who she was holding pretty tightly in her arms as she started to come towards us. I didn't really know what to do, but my boyfriend immediately got up and walked over to make sure that she was okay. I couldn't help but think all of these awful things might happen. After spending so many hours hearing the horror stories on Reddit, I was just terrified she would do something. My boyfriend is a lot more trusting than I am though, and he always has the first instinct of what's the problem and how can I help. He never assumed the bad in anybody. So, this woman is just sobbing by the time she gets to the porch of the condo, and she looks like she's just been through a war zone. She's shaking and hyperventilating and crying. She tells us that basically her boyfriend has been a drunk for a while, and he's been getting worse and worse, and he's been an overall abusive guy. He gets pissed whenever she was focusing on the baby instead of him, and part of what pissed him off was that it wasn't his kid, so he kind of just didn't care about the baby at all. She told us how this time in particular, he was drunk and she was driving him home with the baby in the back seat, and he grabbed the baby's booster seat and tore it out of the car and threw it out of the window while they were driving. She had got the baby out of the seat or something. I don't remember how because as she's telling us about how he started hitting her because she took the baby and ran, we hear this yelling, and we turn and see this angry dude walking up to the condo, and she starts losing it. Drunk and angry, this guy followed her to our condo and was starting to come up to us. He was trying to act like he wasn't upset. He was doing a, "Oh, you guys found her, thank you so much. Baby, let's go home." That kind of thing, but he was slurring his speech and not doing a good job of hiding how messed up he was. My boyfriend has always been a pacifist. Honestly, he's even kind of a pushover. He's really non-confrontational and tries to find a way to talk stuff out and come to an agreement before doing anything. But before I could even say anything, he's across the yard and approaching this guy. As much of a pacifist as he is, he's also huge. He's built like a football player. He's 6'3" and at the time, he was 230 pounds. I'd known my boyfriend since we were 10. At the time, we were 20, and we had been dating for just over a year. I knew him better than anyone. He's never done anything like this before. But he goes up to this guy and goes, "Not another step, dude." And he's shaking as he says it. The guy tries to walk around my boyfriend and goes, "No, it's okay, I'm just gonna take her home." And my boyfriend steps in front of him and shakes his head. "You're drunk. So I'm gonna pretend like maybe you didn't get what I just said. Don't come any closer." It's at this point the guy stops trying to pretend, and he says something like, "You don't know what's going on. That's my girlfriend and I'm gonna take her home." And he tries rounding my boyfriend again. And one more time my boyfriend blocks him and goes, "Stop." I've never heard this tone in his voice before or since. It was scary, it wasn't him. The guy tried one more time before my boyfriend finally put his hand on his chest and pushed him back a bit, keeping his hand on the guy's chest. "I'm telling you right now, you're not going anywhere near that girl and her child, so turn around and walk away." This guy was about 5'6", maybe 5'7", so when he looked up to threaten my boyfriend, he looked like a kid. The guy finally looks up at my boyfriend and he says something that I couldn't hear. My boyfriend said something back and then the guy stared at him for a moment, like he was deciding whether or not to do anything. My boyfriend finally pushed him away, and the guy stumbled back, and then started pointing at me and the girl as he was saying something, and then he started to walk away. I didn't learn until the next day, but the guy had told my boy that he had a gun, and that he was coming back, and that he would kill him and I if we stop him again. My boyfriend's response to this changes depending on who's telling the story. The origin, he told me that he told the guy he would feed him his own teeth, which made me laugh because he's such a dork and he got that from a movie. And ever since then, the line he tells everyone else is, "I'll be waiting." The woman was sobbing, the baby was sobbing, and I was shaking because even though he didn't throw any punches or anything, I could tell that he was ready to hurt this guy if anything else had happened. We called the police and didn't really do much of anything outside of to make sure everyone was breathing and take the girl to her sister's place. We didn't really hear much from her after, but I know my boyfriend sent her an email once or twice, and she's married now to someone else and had another kid last time that they talked. It was a really nice trip, despite that part, and a fight my boy's dad got into with someone in his family. I also had P-meal for the first time. I'm not sure how it's spelled, but it was pretty good.